paradoxes twist reality, bending logic until the impossible feels inevitable. Tonight, we'll explore the puzzles no one can solve. Yet each one will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Stay with us, and let's dive into the mind-bending world of paradoxes together. Don't forget to subscribe, because this is only the beginning. Crocodile. Paradox. Let's suppose your child has been snatched by a crocodile. You're standing at the edge of a river, your heart pounding, your breath shallow. The crocodile looks at you with its cold, unblinking eyes and says, "I will return your child if and only if you can correctly guess what I will do next." At this moment, your world freezes. You realize this isn't just a life or death situation, it's a logical trap. No matter what you answer, you're stepping into a paradox. This dilemma has baffled philosophers and thinkers for centuries. It's not just a puzzle about a predator and its prey. It's a profound exploration of knowledge, logic, and the limits of certainty. Let's carefully walk through this tangled web of reasoning. You have two possible answers to give the crocodile. Consider the first scenario. In this scenario, you predict that the crocodile will return your child. If the crocodile plans to return your child, your prediction is correct, and the crocodile fulfills its promise. Everything aligns and your child is safe. But if the crocodile plans to keep your child, your prediction is wrong, and the crocodile isn't bound to return the child. In this scenario, everything remains logically consistent because the outcome depends entirely on whether your prediction aligns with the crocodile's intention. The real paradox emerges in the second scenario. In this scenario, you predict that the crocodile will not return your child. If the crocodile plans to keep the child, your prediction is correct, but now the crocodile is forced to return the child because your prediction was accurate. This creates a contradiction because the crocodile cannot both keep the child and honor its promise to return them when your prediction is correct. On the other hand, if the crocodile plans to return the child, your prediction is wrong, and by the terms of the deal, the crocodile should not have returned the child in the first place. In either case, the crocodile is trapped in a logical contradiction. So what's really going on here? The crocodile paradox is a classic example of a self-referential paradox, where a statement refers to itself in a way that creates an impossible situation. It's similar to the famous liar's paradox, where someone says, "This statement is false." If the statement is true, then it must be false. But if it's false, then it must be true. The crocodile paradox operates on this same slippery logic, where the crocodile's promise collapses under its own weight. But beyond the logical puzzle, the crocodile paradox also raises deeper philosophical questions. At its core, it's about the nature of promises, truth, and trust. If a promise creates a scenario where it cannot logically be kept, is it really a promise at all? And if a situation is built on contradictory rules, can any outcome truly be fair or just? In a way, the paradox reflects real-world situations where agreements are made under flawed premises. Think about legal contracts filled with loopholes, political promises built on conflicting conditions, or even personal dilemmas where every choice seems to backfire. The crocodile paradox isn't just a brain teaser. It's a mirror reflecting the complexity and imperfection of the promises we make and the expectations we set. But let's not forget the crocodile in this story. The paradox also reveals something about power and control. The crocodile isn't just a passive participant in this riddle, it's the architect of the trap. By setting the rules in a way that guarantees contradiction, the crocodile ensures that no answer can fully satisfy the agreement. In a sense, it represents authority structures or systems where the rules are intentionally rigged to maintain control, even in the face of logic and fairness. So can this paradox ever be solved? Philosophers have debated this question for centuries, and the general consensus is no. The paradox isn't meant to have a resolution because it's not about finding an answer, it's about understanding the problem. It's a thought experiment designed to expose the limits of language, logic, and our assumptions about fairness and promises. But perhaps the real lesson of the crocodile paradox is this. Not every question has an answer. Not every problem can be untangled through pure reasoning, and sometimes the power lies not in solving the puzzle, but in recognizing the trap it creates. So if you ever find yourself face to face with a crocodile offering a deal that seems impossible to fulfill, remember this paradox. Sometimes the game is rigged from the start, and the only winning move is to recognize the paradox for what it is, a cleverly constructed trap hiding behind the illusion of choice. Friendship. Paradox. Why do your friends seem to have more friends than you? It's not just in your head. It's a real phenomenon called the friendship paradox. This counterintuitive idea suggests that, on average, your friends are more popular than you are. How is that possible? And more importantly, what does it reveal about the way we interact, connect, and compare ourselves to others? Let's start with the math behind the paradox. Imagine a social network. Not the kind on your phone, but the web of connections that links people together. Some individuals have only a few friends while others are social butterflies, connected to dozens or even hundreds of people. The friendship paradox emerges because people with lots of friends are more likely to be your friends. Why? Think of it this way. If someone has 100 friends, they have 100 chances to be connected to you, while someone with only 2 friends has just 2 chances. In a network, the popular people act as hubs, disproportionately influencing the average number of friends your friends have. This mathematical quirk means that when you compare yourself to your friends, you're more likely to be comparing yourself to someone with above-average popularity. And because of this bias, your friends on average will seem to have more connections than you do. But the friendship paradox isn't just about self-perception. It's a reflection of how networks operate, from social circles to the internet. It has profound psychological and social implications, especially in an age dominated by social media. When we scroll through platforms like Instagram or Facebook, we often see the highlights of other people's lives, vacations, parties, achievements, shared by our most connected friends. This creates the illusion that everyone else is more popular, more successful, or more interesting than we are. The friendship paradox explains why this illusion is so pervasive. We're naturally more exposed to the lives of the most connected individuals, amplifying the sense of comparison. This can have a significant impact on mental health. Research shows that social comparison is a key driver of anxiety, envy, and even depression. The friendship paradox reminds us that these comparisons are often based on a distorted perspective. Your friends might seem more connected, but that's largely because of how networks work, not because you're less valuable or less connected yourself. Interestingly, the friendship paradox isn't just a curiosity. It has practical applications in public health. For example, it's used to identify influential individuals in social networks during a disease outbreak. Health officials might target vaccination campaigns or public health messages to people who are more connected, as they're more likely to influence others. By leveraging the paradox, we can improve the spread of helpful information and curb the spread of harmful misinformation or diseases. The paradox also sheds light on the dynamics of influence and inequality in networks. In any network, whether it's a group of friends, a professional community, or a social media platform, connections aren't distributed evenly. A small number of individuals often hold a disproportionate amount of influence. The friendship paradox reveals how this inequality shapes our perceptions, interactions, and even opportunities. But perhaps the most profound lesson of the friendship paradox is what it teaches us about perspective. It reminds us that our view of the world is always partial, shaped by the connections and relationships we have. Just as your friends seem more popular, your perception of other aspects of life, success, happiness, or wealth might be skewed by the people you're exposed to. The paradox invites us to question these perceptions, to recognize their limitations, and to focus on what truly matters. The friendship paradox isn't just about numbers, it's about understanding how we relate to others and how networks influence our lives. It challenges us to rethink the way we compare ourselves to others, to see beyond the surface of popularity, and to appreciate the unique connections we have. Because in the end, it's not about how many friends you have, it's about the depth, meaning, and quality of those relationships. And no paradox can take that away from you. Tolerance. Paradox. Can a tolerant society remain tolerant if it tolerates intolerance? This is the tolerance paradox, a profound and troubling dilemma first introduced by philosopher Karl Popper. It challenges the very foundation of what it means to live in an open, free society. At its core is a simple, yet uncomfortable question. How far should we go in accepting opposing viewpoints, especially when those viewpoints threaten the very fabric of tolerance itself? Let's imagine a society built on the principle of tolerance. People are free to express their beliefs, live how they want, and engage in open dialogue. But then, an intolerant ideology begins to emerge, one that rejects the values of tolerance and actively works to suppress others' freedoms. What should the tolerant society do? If it tolerates the intolerant, it risks being overrun by those who reject tolerance altogether. But if it doesn't tolerate the intolerant, hasn't it abandoned its own principle of tolerance? This is the heart of the paradox. Tolerance is often seen as an absolute good, but the tolerance paradox reveals its limits. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that tolerance, when taken to an extreme, can become self-destructive. Popper introduced this idea in his 1945 book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. He argued that unlimited tolerance leads to the erosion of tolerance itself. If a society allows intolerant ideologies to take root and spread unchecked, those ideologies can eventually undermine the freedoms that made the society tolerant in the first place. Popper's solution was clear but controversial. A tolerant society must reserve the right to be intolerant toward intolerance. On the surface, this might sound contradictory. After all, how can a society committed to tolerance justify being intolerant? But Popper's argument isn't about suppressing disagreement or silencing opposing viewpoints. It's about drawing a line when those viewpoints actively threaten the rights and safety of others. The goal isn't to eliminate conflict or disagreement, but to protect the very conditions that make a tolerant society possible. The tolerance paradox isn't just a philosophical puzzle, it has real-world implications. Consider freedom of speech, one of the cornerstones of a tolerant society. Should this freedom extend to those who use it to spread hate speech, incite violence, or advocate for the suppression of others' freedoms? Some argue that even the most offensive ideas should be allowed in the name of free expression, trusting that open debate will expose and discredit harmful views. Others contend that allowing such speech can create an environment where intolerance thrives, ultimately putting vulnerable groups at risk. History offers plenty of examples where the tolerance paradox has played out in dramatic ways. In the early 20th century, many democratic nations tolerated the rise of authoritarian movements, believing they could coexist with democratic values. But in cases like Nazi Germany, that tolerance allowed intolerant ideologies to gain power and dismantle democracy from within. These historical lessons show that unchecked tolerance can have devastating consequences. But where should we draw the line? This is where the tolerance paradox becomes especially tricky. Not all forms of intolerance are equally dangerous, and not all disagreements threaten the fabric of society. Disagreeing with someone's political views or cultural practices isn't the same as advocating for their suppression. The challenge lies in distinguishing between harmful intolerance that needs to be addressed and healthy conflict that should be encouraged. Critics of Popper's idea often raise concerns about who gets to decide what counts as intolerant. They argue that labeling certain ideas or groups as intolerant can be subjective and prone to abuse. A government or group in power could misuse this principle to silence dissent under the guise of protecting tolerance. This highlights the delicate balance a society must strike between protecting itself and avoiding authoritarianism. The tolerance paradox also raises important questions about human psychology and group dynamics. Intolerance often arises from fear, ignorance, or a sense of threat. Addressing these underlying causes through education, dialogue, and empathy can be more effective than simply suppressing intolerant ideas. But even these approaches have limits, especially when dealing with ideologies that are fundamentally opposed to dialogue or compromise. In today's polarized world, the tolerance paradox feels more relevant than ever. We see debates over free speech, censorship, and the boundaries of tolerance play out daily, from social media platforms to political arenas. As we navigate these challenges, the paradox reminds us that tolerance isn't just about accepting differences. It's about actively protecting the principles that make coexistence possible. So what can we learn from the tolerance paradox? First, it teaches us that tolerance has limits, and those limits are necessary to preserve the values we hold dear. Second, it challenges us to think critically about how we respond to intolerance, whether through open dialogue, legal protections, or in extreme cases, restrictions. And finally, it reminds us that a tolerant society is not a passive one. It requires vigilance, courage, and a willingness to confront difficult questions about freedom, fairness, and justice. The tolerance paradox isn't just a problem to be solved. It's a reflection of the complexities of living in a diverse and open society. It forces us to grapple with the tension between our ideals and the realities of human behavior. And perhaps its greatest lesson is that tolerance isn't a static principle. It's a dynamic process, one that requires constant effort to uphold. Paradox of choice. Imagine walking into an ice cream shop. You're craving something sweet and you're ready to indulge. But instead of the usual 5 or 6 flavors, you're greeted with 50 options: chocolate, vanilla, pistachio, salted caramel, mango sorbet, rocky road, and so many more. At first, you're thrilled. But as you try to decide, you start to feel overwhelmed. You second-guess yourself. What if you choose pistachio but miss out on the salted caramel? What if rocky road would have been perfect? Suddenly, what should have been a simple and joyful decision turns into a stressful, exhausting ordeal. This is the paradox of choice. The idea that while more choices may seem better, they can actually make us less happy, more anxious, and ultimately less satisfied with the decisions we make. It's a concept that challenges one of modern society's biggest assumptions, that freedom of choice is always a good thing. The paradox of choice was popularized by psychologist Barry Schwartz, who argued that having too many options can paralyze us. When faced with an overwhelming number of choices, we often struggle to make a decision at all. Think about it. How many times have you spent ages scrolling through streaming platforms, unable to pick a movie, only to end up re-watching something familiar? The more options we have, the harder it is to decide because each choice carries the fear of missing out on something better. But the paradox doesn't stop at indecision. It also affects how satisfied we feel after we make a choice. Let's go back to the ice cream shop. You finally decide on salted caramel. But as you eat it, you can't help but wonder if you would have enjoyed pistachio more. Even if the salted caramel is delicious, your enjoyment is diminished by the nagging thought of what you might have missed. This is known as post-decision regret, and it's one of the key ways the paradox of choice undermines our happiness. One reason this happens is because of something psychologists call opportunity cost. Every time we make a choice, we're also choosing not to do something else. When there are only a few options, the opportunity cost feels small. But when there are dozens or hundreds of possibilities, the cost of what we didn't choose feels enormous. We become hyper-aware of the alternatives we gave up, and this makes it harder to fully enjoy the option we picked. Another factor at play is our own expectations. The more options we have, the higher our expectations become. If you only have 3 ice cream flavors to choose from, you might just be happy with what you get. But when there are 50, you expect the perfect flavor, the one that will blow your mind. And if the salted caramel doesn't deliver that impossible level of satisfaction, you feel disappointed, not because it wasn't good, but because it wasn't perfect. The paradox of choice shows us that more options don't just give us more freedom, they also give us more room for disappointment. Interestingly, the paradox of choice doesn't affect everyone in the same way. Some people, known as maximizers, feel compelled to find the absolute best option in any situation. Maximizers are the ones who will read hundreds of reviews before buying a phone, or spend hours researching restaurants before picking a place to eat. While this thoroughness might seem like a good thing, it often leads to stress and dissatisfaction because maximizers are constantly worrying about whether they made the right choice. On the other hand, satisficers are people who aim for good enough. They make decisions quickly and don't obsess over what they might have missed, which often makes them happier and more relaxed. The paradox of choice has profound implications for how we live our lives. In today's world, we're bombarded with options: what to eat, what to wear, what to watch, where to live, who to date, what career to pursue. On the surface, this abundance of choice seems empowering. But in reality, it can lead to decision fatigue, a state where the sheer effort of choosing leaves us drained and less capable of making good decisions. So, how do we navigate the paradox of choice? One solution is to embrace the idea of good enough. Instead of obsessing over finding the perfect option, we can learn to appreciate the choices we make and let go of what we didn't choose. Another strategy is to set limits on the number of options we consider. For example, instead of endlessly scrolling through a streaming platform, we could pick from the first 5 movies we see. By simplifying our decision-making process, we reduce stress and increase satisfaction. The paradox of choice also teaches us a deeper lesson about happiness. True happiness doesn't come from having unlimited options. It comes from being present and content with the choices we make. It reminds us that freedom isn't about having endless possibilities. It's about having the clarity and confidence to choose without regret. In the end, the paradox of choice isn't just about ice cream flavors or streaming platforms. It's a reflection of how we navigate the complexity of modern life. It challenges us to rethink our assumptions about freedom and happiness, and to recognize that sometimes, less really is more. By understanding this paradox, we can make better decisions, find greater peace of mind, and ultimately live more fulfilling lives. Value paradox. Why is water, which is essential for life, so cheap, while diamonds, which have no real survival value, are so expensive? This is the value paradox, also known as the diamond water paradox, and it challenges how we think about worth, utility, and the things we value in life. First articulated by Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, this paradox has puzzled thinkers for centuries, revealing surprising truths about human decision-making and the nature of value. To understand the value paradox, let's start with the basics. Water is vital. We need it to drink, to grow food, to clean, to survive. Without water, life as we know it would end. Diamonds, on the other hand, are essentially luxury items. They're used for adornment, industrial tools, and symbolic gestures like engagement rings. But you could live your entire life without ever needing a diamond. So why is it that water, which is essential, is often free or costs very little, while diamonds, which are non-essential, are staggeringly expensive? The paradox lies in the difference between two types of value: utility and exchange value. Utility refers to the usefulness of something, its ability to satisfy a need or want. Water has enormous utility because it's indispensable for life. Exchange value, on the other hand, refers to what something can be traded for in a market. And this is where the paradox emerges. Water has high utility but low exchange value, while diamonds have low utility but high exchange value. The resolution to this paradox lies in a concept called marginal utility, which explains how value is influenced by scarcity and context. Marginal utility is the additional satisfaction or benefit you get from consuming one more unit of something. Think of it this way. If you're stranded in the desert, dying of thirst, a glass of water would be priceless. It could save your life. But if you're at home with unlimited access to clean water, an extra glass has little value because your basic needs are already met. The value of water depends not just on its overall importance, but on how much of it you already have. Diamonds, in contrast, are rare. Their scarcity means that each individual diamond has a high marginal utility because they're not easily available. People are willing to pay a premium for them, even though they don't have the life-saving utility of water. The value paradox shows us that value isn't just about necessity. It's about context, availability, and perception. This paradox has profound implications for economics and human behavior. It reveals how markets operate, not on absolute value, but on relative value. People don't pay for how important something is in an abstract sense. They pay for how much it's worth to them in the moment, given their needs and circumstances. This is why luxury goods, which are scarce and desirable, command high prices even if they have little practical use. The value paradox also challenges us to think critically about the things we prioritize and pursue. It reminds us that value is often subjective, shaped by culture, society, and individual preferences. What one person sees as valuable, another might see as unnecessary. Diamonds, for example, are prized in many cultures as symbols of love, status, and wealth. But their value is largely a social construct. Water, on the other hand, is often taken for granted because of its abundance, even though it's the foundation of life itself. In modern economics, the value paradox has been resolved through the theories of supply and demand. Water is cheap because it's abundant and easy to access in most parts of the world. Diamonds are expensive because they're scarce and difficult to mine, refine, and bring to market. The interplay between supply, demand, and marginal utility creates the price differences we observe. But this resolution doesn't diminish the paradox, it deepens it. It forces us to recognize how easily scarcity and perception can distort our understanding of worth. The value paradox also holds lessons for how we think about the broader economy and global issues. Consider water again. While it may be inexpensive in places with abundant access, in drought-stricken regions or areas with poor infrastructure, clean water can become a highly valuable and even unaffordable resource. The paradox reminds us of the fragility of abundance and the importance of managing resources wisely. On a more philosophical level, the value paradox invites us to reflect on the things we truly value in life. Do we prize the essential but often invisible resources, like water, air, and community? Or do we chase the rare and glamorous, like diamonds and status symbols, at the expense of what really sustains us? It's a question that goes beyond economics, touching on our priorities as individuals and societies. Ultimately, the value paradox is more than a quirky economic puzzle. It's a lens through which we can explore the complexity of human choices, the intricacies of markets, and the values that shape our world. It teaches us that value is never absolute. It's always contextual, dynamic, and deeply tied to how we see ourselves and our place in the world. And perhaps that's the paradox's greatest lesson, that what we value says as much about us as it does about the things we value. Paradox of thrift. Imagine being told that saving your money, a habit you've always thought was responsible and wise, could actually harm the economy. How is that possible? This is the paradox of thrift, an economic idea that flips our understanding of personal finance on its head. It reveals a fascinating contradiction. What's good for an individual may not always be good for society as a whole. It forces us to rethink the balance between saving and spending, especially during times of economic uncertainty. The paradox starts with a simple common sense principle. Saving is good. When you save, you're setting money aside for the future, building financial security, and ensuring that you can weather unexpected expenses. But in an economy, saving doesn't happen in isolation. Your decision to save means spending less, and spending less affects the businesses and workers who depend on consumer demand. The paradox of thrift suggests that when everyone saves at the same time, it can lead to unintended consequences that ripple through the entire economy. Let's break it down. Imagine a small town where everyone suddenly decides to save more money. People stop eating out, shopping for clothes, and taking vacations. At first, this might seem like a good idea. Families are being cautious and preparing for the future. But as spending decreases, local businesses see fewer customers. Restaurants, shops, and travel agencies begin to struggle. They cut back on hiring, lay off workers, or even close their doors. With fewer jobs and less income, people have even less money to spend. The cycle feeds on itself, dragging the economy down further. This is the heart of the paradox of thrift. What's rational and beneficial for one person, saving, can become harmful when everyone does it at once. It's a classic example of what economists call the fallacy of composition, where what's true for the individual isn't necessarily true for the group. While saving money might help you personally, if everyone tightens their belts simultaneously, the overall economy suffers. The paradox was popularized by British economist John Maynard Keynes during the Great Depression. Keynes argued that in times of economic downturn, the collective urge to save could make things worse. When demand falls, businesses cut production, unemployment rises, and the economy spirals downward. In these situations, Keynes suggested, what the economy needs isn't more saving, it's more spending. By spending money, people create demand, which drives production, creates jobs, and stimulates growth. But the paradox of thrift doesn't mean saving is always bad. In a healthy economy, saving plays an important role in fueling long-term growth. Savings become investments, funding businesses, infrastructure projects, and innovation. The paradox applies specifically to periods of economic contraction, when a sudden increase in saving can exacerbate a recession. It's a reminder that the impact of saving depends on the broader economic context. The paradox also raises important questions about the role of government in managing the economy. If individuals and businesses are cutting back during a recession, who can step in to keep demand alive? Keynes argued that this is where governments come in. Through public spending on projects like infrastructure, education, or healthcare, governments can inject money into the economy, create jobs, and stimulate demand. This idea forms the basis of Keynesian economics, which has shaped how many countries respond to economic crises. Critics of the paradox of thrift argue that it oversimplifies the complexities of an economy. Some believe that saving, even during a downturn, is ultimately beneficial because it leads to investment and future growth. Others worry that encouraging spending during a recession can lead to excessive debt, both for individuals and governments. These debates highlight the tension between short-term solutions and long-term stability, a challenge that policymakers face in every economic crisis. The paradox of thrift also has a psychological dimension. In uncertain times, fear and anxiety drive people to save more, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. This is why consumer confidence plays such a critical role in economic health. When people feel optimistic about the future, they're more likely to spend, fueling growth. When fear takes over, the economy contracts. The paradox reminds us that economics isn't just about numbers. It's about human behavior and the emotions that drive our decisions. So what can we learn from the paradox of thrift? First, it teaches us to think critically about the relationship between individual choices and collective outcomes. It shows that actions that seem responsible on a personal level can have unintended consequences when scaled up. Second, it highlights the importance of balance. Saving and spending are both essential, but their impact depends on timing and context. And finally, it underscores the interconnectedness of an economy. No one acts in isolation. Our decisions affect others, and their decisions affect us. In a world that often celebrates individual responsibility, the paradox of thrift challenges us to think collectively. It reminds us that the health of an economy depends not just on what we do for ourselves, but on how we contribute to the broader system. And perhaps most importantly, it shows us that economics isn't just about dollars and cents. It's about the choices we make and the values we share as a society. So the next time you're deciding whether to save or spend, remember, it's not just a personal decision. It's part of a much larger story. And that's what makes the paradox of thrift so life-changing. It forces us to see the bigger picture, to think beyond ourselves, and to navigate the delicate balance between individual and collective well-being. Stability, instability, paradox. Imagine a world where the more secure you try to make things, the more dangerous they become. It sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? But this is the essence of the stability-instability paradox, a concept rooted in political science and international relations that reveals how attempts to maintain peace and stability can paradoxically increase the likelihood of conflict. It's a fascinating and unsettling idea that challenges our understanding of security and the delicate balance of power. The stability-instability paradox emerged during the Cold War, a period defined by the tension between two nuclear superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Both nations possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other and the world many times over. This concept of mutually assured destruction created what seemed like an ironic form of peace. After all, no rational actor would start a nuclear war knowing it would result in total annihilation. But here's where the paradox comes in. While the threat of nuclear war stabilized relations at the global level, it made smaller, localized conflicts more likely. Why? Because when two major powers know that full-scale war is off the table, they might feel emboldened to engage in smaller, indirect confrontations. During the Cold War, this played out in the form of proxy wars, conflicts in Vietnam, Korea, and Afghanistan, where the superpowers supported opposing sides without directly confronting each other. The very stability created by the nuclear stalemate paradoxically made these smaller wars more likely. At its core, the stability-instability paradox is about incentives. When stability is maintained at the highest level through a balance of power, deterrence, or fear of escalation, it can create a sense of security that lowers the perceived risks of smaller-scale conflicts. Actors may feel they can engage in limited aggression without triggering a catastrophic response. In this way, the paradox shows how efforts to maintain peace can unintentionally create opportunities for violence. But the paradox isn't confined to the Cold War. It has profound implications for modern geopolitics. Consider the current era of nuclear-armed states. While the doctrine of mutually assured destruction still acts as a deterrent against full-scale war, the same dynamic plays out in regional conflicts. For example, tensions between nuclear-armed neighbors like India and Pakistan have occasionally flared into skirmishes and border disputes, even as the threat of nuclear escalation looms in the background. The paradox reminds us that stability at one level can create instability at another. The stability-instability paradox also applies to areas beyond warfare. Take cybersecurity, for example. As nations and organizations build increasingly secure digital systems, they inadvertently escalate the arms race with hackers and cybercriminals. The more robust the defenses, the more sophisticated the attacks become, leading to a cycle of stability at the systemic level and instability at the tactical level. Similarly, in economics, efforts to stabilize markets through regulation can sometimes create conditions for localized bubbles or crises, as actors exploit perceived safety nets. The paradox raises difficult questions about the nature of security and power. How do we balance efforts to maintain stability with the unintended consequences of those efforts? Is it possible to create a system that is both secure and flexible without encouraging the kind of instability the paradox describes? These questions have no easy answers, but they highlight the importance of thinking critically about the ripple effects of our actions. One of the most profound lessons of the stability-instability paradox is the importance of humility in decision-making. It reminds us that systems, whether they are geopolitical alliances, technological networks, or economic markets, are complex and interconnected. Actions intended to solve one problem often create new ones, and the consequences of those actions can be difficult to predict. The paradox challenges us to think beyond short-term goals and consider the broader dynamics at play. It also underscores the need for communication and trust. In the context of international relations, transparency and dialogue can help mitigate the risks of miscalculation. When actors understand each other's intentions and capabilities, they're less likely to stumble into conflicts that could spiral out of control. The stability-instability paradox shows us the dangers of assuming that stability is self-sustaining. It requires constant effort, cooperation, and vigilance. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the paradox is its persistence. As long as there are imbalances of power or competing interests, the dynamics it describes will continue to shape our world. The paradox forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that peace is fragile and often paradoxical in nature. It's not simply the absence of conflict, it's a delicate equilibrium that can tip into instability when pushed too far. So what can we learn from the stability-instability paradox? First, it teaches us to question the assumption that stability is always a good thing. While stability can reduce the likelihood of large-scale conflict, it can also create conditions for smaller-scale aggression. Second, it challenges us to think critically about the unintended consequences of our actions, particularly in complex systems. And finally, it reminds us that true security requires more than deterrence. It requires understanding, adaptability, and a willingness to engage with uncertainty. Hedonism paradox. What if the harder you chase happiness, the further away it gets? This is the hedonism paradox, a fascinating and counterintuitive concept that challenges our most basic assumptions about pleasure, happiness, and the pursuit of a meaningful life. At its core, the paradox reveals a strange truth. When you make pleasure your ultimate goal, it often eludes you. But why does this happen, and what does it teach us about the nature of happiness? Let's start by unpacking what hedonism means. Hedonism is the philosophical idea that pleasure is the highest good, the ultimate purpose of life. On the surface, it seems logical. After all, who doesn't want to be happy? Whether it's enjoying a delicious meal, listening to beautiful music, or spending time with loved ones, pleasure is a universal human experience. Hedonism suggests that we should maximize these experiences to lead the best possible life. But the hedonism paradox turns this idea on its head. It suggests that the more you focus on pleasure as an end in itself, the harder it becomes to attain. Imagine this: you're at a party, determined to have the best time ever. You carefully plan every detail, what to wear, who to talk to, even what you'll eat and drink. But as the night goes on, you find yourself constantly evaluating whether you're having fun. You compare your experience to others, worry that you're not doing enough, and end up feeling disappointed. The more you try to force happiness, the less you enjoy yourself. This is the hedonism paradox in action. It's not that pleasure is bad, it's that fixating on it can backfire. The paradox occurs because happiness is often a byproduct of other activities, not something you can achieve directly. When you focus too much on being happy, you become overly self-conscious and start analyzing your feelings. This self-awareness creates pressure and anxiety, making it harder to relax and enjoy the moment. In psychological terms, this is known as the paradoxical effect. By focusing too much on the outcome, happiness, you lose sight of the process, which is where true joy often resides. Philosophers and psychologists have explored this paradox for centuries. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, famously wrote that happiness cannot be pursued, it must ensue as a result of living a meaningful life. Frankl's idea suggests that when we shift our focus away from chasing pleasure and toward engaging in meaningful activities, happiness tends to follow naturally. This aligns with modern research in positive psychology, which shows that people who prioritize purpose and connection over pleasure often report higher levels of life satisfaction. But the hedonism paradox doesn't mean that pleasure is unimportant. It highlights the need for balance. Pleasure is a vital part of life, but it's best experienced indirectly. Think about a hobby you love: painting, hiking, or playing music. When you're fully immersed in the activity, you're not thinking about how happy it's making you. You're simply enjoying the experience. Paradoxically, this lack of focus on happiness often leads to deeper and more lasting joy. The paradox also raises important questions about modern society. We live in a culture that constantly encourages us to seek happiness through consumerism, social media, and self-help advice. Advertisements promise that the right car, vacation, or gadget will make us happy. Social media bombards us with curated images of other people's seemingly perfect lives, fueling the idea that happiness is something we should always be chasing. But the hedonism paradox reminds us that this constant pursuit can be self-defeating. It challenges us to rethink what it means to live a fulfilling life, and to resist the pressure to measure our worth by how happy we appear to be. So, how can we escape the trap of the hedonism paradox? One approach is to focus on intrinsic goals rather than extrinsic ones. Intrinsic goals are things we value for their own sake, like personal growth, relationships, and creativity. Extrinsic goals, like money, status, or appearance, are often pursued because we think they'll bring us happiness. Research shows that people who prioritize intrinsic goals tend to be happier and more fulfilled because they're not chasing external validation. Another strategy is to cultivate mindfulness, the practice of being fully present in the moment. Mindfulness helps us let go of the constant need to evaluate our experiences and instead allows us to simply enjoy them. By focusing on what we're doing rather than how it makes us feel, we can break free from the self-consciousness that fuels the paradox. The hedonism paradox also invites us to embrace the full range of human emotions. Happiness is just one piece of the puzzle. Life is made up of highs and lows, joy and sorrow, excitement and boredom. By accepting all of these experiences as part of the human condition, we can find a deeper sense of peace and contentment. Paradoxically, when we stop trying so hard to be happy, we often find that happiness sneaks up on us when we least expect it. Saw writes, "Paradox. How many grains of sand make a heap? One grain certainly isn't a heap. 2 grains aren't either. But what if you keep adding grains one at a time? At what exact point does the pile of sand become a heap?" This question lies at the heart of the Sawwright's paradox, a fascinating thought experiment that reveals how seemingly simple ideas can unravel into profound complexity. At first glance, the paradox seems easy to dismiss. After all, you might say a heap is just a general term. It doesn't need to be precise. But the moment you start asking where the line is drawn, things get tricky. If one grain doesn't make a heap, and adding one more grain doesn't suddenly transform it into a heap, does that mean no amount of grains can ever form a heap? This slippery slope of reasoning challenges not just how we define heaps of sand, but how we deal with vague concepts in general. The Sawwright's paradox takes its name from the Greek word sauros, meaning heap, and has puzzled philosophers for centuries. But it isn't just about sand. It's about how we define anything that lacks clear boundaries. Think about baldness. At what point does a person with thinning hair become bald? Or consider wealth. How many dollars do you need to go from being poor to rich? These questions seem trivial at first, but reveal a deeper truth about the limits of language and reasoning. The paradox exposes a fundamental problem with vague concepts. They resist precise definitions. Words like heap, bald, or rich are useful because they allow us to talk about general ideas without needing exact measurements. But when pushed to their limits, these concepts become ambiguous. The Sawwright's paradox forces us to confront this ambiguity and question how we can make sense of a world filled with fuzzy boundaries. One proposed way to address the Sawwright's paradox is by introducing the idea of degrees or gradual change. Instead of thinking in absolutes, heap or not a heap, we could think in terms of probabilities or thresholds. For instance, we might say that as the number of grains increases, the likelihood of the pile being considered a heap gradually rises. This approach avoids drawing a hard line but raises another question. How do we decide where to place these thresholds? Even with degrees, the problem of vagueness remains. Another proposed solution is to embrace the idea of context. In some contexts, a pile of 50 grains might be called a heap, while in others, it might not. For example, if you're talking about grains of sand on a beach, a small pile might not qualify as a heap. But if you're looking at grains on a table, even a tiny pile might seem like a heap by comparison. This context-dependent view acknowledges that definitions are flexible, shaped by the situations in which they're used. The Sawwright's paradox doesn't just challenge how we think about words, it has real-world implications. Take laws, for example. Many legal systems rely on vague concepts like reasonable doubt, or excessive force. These terms are intentionally left flexible to accommodate different situations, but they also create room for interpretation and disagreement. The paradox reminds us that while vagueness can be useful, it can also lead to uncertainty and conflict. Similarly, the Sorites paradox applies to social and ethical questions. Consider climate change. At what point does a gradual increase in temperature become a crisis? Or think about social issues like inequality. How much disparity is too much? These are not just abstract questions. They influence how we respond to some of the most pressing challenges of our time. The Sorites paradox forces us to confront the fact that many of these problems don't have clear-cut solutions. But perhaps the most profound lesson of the Sorites paradox is what it reveals about our need for clarity in a messy, ambiguous world. We like to think in categories, dividing things into neat boxes. This is a heap, this isn't. This is bald, this isn't. But the world rarely conforms to such clear distinctions. The Sorites paradox challenges us to embrace complexity and uncertainty, recognizing that many of the concepts we use are imprecise by nature. Ship of Theseus. If you replace every part of a ship piece by piece until none of the original parts remain, is it still the same ship? This is the Ship of Theseus, an ancient philosophical puzzle that challenges our understanding of identity, change, and continuity. It's a thought experiment that has fascinated thinkers for over 2,000 years. From the time of the Greek philosopher Plutarch to modern debates about consciousness, technology, and even personal identity. Imagine Theseus, the mythical founder of Athens, sailing across the seas in his grand ship. Over time, the ship's wooden planks begin to rot. To preserve it, the Athenians replace each plank, one by one, until eventually, none of the original wood remains. Now, centuries later, every part has been swapped out. Is this still the same ship that Theseus sailed? Or has it become a completely different vessel? The paradox doesn't stop there. Suppose someone collects all the original planks that were removed and reassembles them into a ship. Which one, if either, is the real ship of Theseus, the restored original, or the maintained replacement? This paradox raises deep questions about what it means for something to remain itself over time. Is identity tied to physical components, or is it defined by continuity, purpose, and function? The Ship of Theseus illustrates the challenge of defining identity in a world of constant change. On the surface, the question seems abstract, but its implications reach far beyond ships and wooden planks. Consider your own body. From the moment you were born, the cells in your body have been dying and regenerating. Over the span of a decade, nearly every cell is replaced. Are you still the same person you were 10 years ago? If not, what has changed, and what has stayed the same? This thought experiment touches on the nature of personal identity. Are you defined by your physical body, your memories, your consciousness, or something more intangible like your soul? In modern times, the Ship of Theseus has found new relevance in discussions about technology and artificial intelligence. Imagine a robot whose parts are replaced one by one. At what point does it cease to be the same robot? Or consider a digital consciousness that is copied and transferred to a new platform. Is the copied version still you? The paradox also applies to objects and organizations. Think about a company that gradually replaces all its employees, buildings, and equipment over decades. Is it still the same company? Or is it something entirely new? Philosophers have proposed several ways to approach the Ship of Theseus. One idea is that identity depends on continuity of structure and function rather than specific materials. Under this view, the ship remains the same because it continues to serve the same purpose and maintain the same form. Another perspective suggests that identity is tied to psychological continuity. For humans, this might mean that as long as memories and consciousness persist, we are the same person, even if our bodies change. But these solutions are not without their critics. Some argue that identity is inherently fluid and that trying to draw hard boundaries is a mistake. In this view, The Ship of Theseus isn't about finding a definitive answer, but about exploring the complexity of existence and change. The paradox also invites us to reflect on our relationship with time. Change is inevitable, yet we cling to the idea of permanence. The Ship of Theseus challenges this by showing that identity might be less about what something is at any given moment, and more about the story it tells across time. Perhaps the ship remains Theseus's, not because of its materials, but because of its history, its journey, and the meaning we attach to it. The Ship of Theseus isn't just an abstract puzzle, it's a mirror reflecting our own struggles with identity. As we grow, learn, and change, we ask ourselves, am I still the same person I used to be? Or have I become someone entirely new? The problem of evil. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the world holds its breath between night and day, a mother sits beside her child's hospital bed. The machines beep softly, marking time in a rhythm that has become her world. She watches her daughter's small chest rise and fall, each breath a mixture of hope and fear. In this sterile room, surrounded by the architecture of human compassion and medical science, an ancient question burns with immediate urgency. If God is all-loving and all-powerful, why does this suffering exist? This scene, repeated countless times throughout human history, embodies one of philosophy's most enduring and emotionally challenging puzzles, the problem of evil. It's a question that has tested the faith of believers, provided ammunition for skeptics, and challenged theologians for millennia. The problem is elegant in its simplicity, yet devastating in its implications. The classical formulation presents what seems like an ironclad logical argument. If God possesses three attributes that most religious traditions ascribe to the divine: omnipotence, all-powerful; omniscience, all-knowing; and omnibenevolence, all-loving, then evil and suffering should not exist. An all-loving God would want to eliminate suffering. An all-powerful God would have the ability to eliminate it. An all-knowing God would be aware of all suffering and know how to prevent it. Yet suffering persists throughout the world in forms that seem gratuitous, meaningless, and cruel. To fully appreciate the depth of this problem, we must consider the different types of evil that challenge divine goodness. Moral evil encompasses the suffering that humans inflict upon each other: war, murder, cruelty, deception, and oppression. These actions seem to flow from human choices and could presumably be prevented by divine intervention without eliminating human freedom entirely. Natural evil presents an even more challenging category: earthquakes that bury entire cities, diseases that ravage the innocent, storms that destroy communities, and the countless forms of suffering built into the very structure of the natural world. A tsunami doesn't choose its victims based on their moral character. Cancer doesn't discriminate between the virtuous and the wicked. These forms of suffering seem particularly difficult to reconcile with the idea of a loving creator. Perhaps most troubling is what philosophers call gratuitous evil. Suffering that serves no apparent purpose, contributes to no greater good, and seems utterly meaningless. The death of a child from genetic disease, the agony of animals in natural disasters, the psychological torment of innocent victims. These experiences challenge our deepest assumptions about justice, meaning, and divine love. Believers and theologians have developed numerous responses to this challenge, each attempting to preserve divine attributes while acknowledging the reality of suffering. These responses, known as theodicies, represent some of the most sophisticated thinking in human intellectual history. The free will defense, perhaps the most influential theodicy, argues that God permits evil as a necessary consequence of granting humans genuine freedom. According to this view, God could have created beings incapable of evil, but such beings would be essentially robots, incapable of genuine love, moral growth, or meaningful relationships. The capacity for evil is the price of authentic goodness. Consider the difference between a programmed expression of affection and a freely chosen act of love. A computer can be programmed to display the words, "I love you," but this expression lacks the meaning that comes from choice. Similarly, this theodicy argues, God values genuine virtue over programmed behavior, even though genuine virtue requires the possibility of vice. The free will defense handles moral evil relatively well, but natural evil presents greater challenges. Why would a loving God create a world where natural disasters cause suffering independently of human choices? Some theologians argue that natural laws, like moral freedom, are necessary for a world that supports genuine choice and meaningful action. A world where natural laws could be arbitrarily suspended to prevent suffering might be a world where human actions lose their significance and consequences. The soul-making theodicy, developed by philosopher John Hick, suggests that suffering serves a crucial role in human spiritual development. From this perspective, the world is not intended as a paradise, but as a vale of soul-making, where challenges and difficulties provide opportunities for growth, compassion, and moral development. This theodicy finds support in human experience. Many people report that their most difficult experiences led to their greatest personal growth. Suffering often develops empathy, resilience, and wisdom in ways that comfort cannot. The person who has never faced adversity might lack the depth of character that comes from overcoming challenges. Yet critics note that this explanation seems inadequate to account for the extremity and distribution of suffering. Why do some people face overwhelming challenges while others live relatively comfortable lives? How does the suffering of infants or those with severe cognitive disabilities contribute to their spiritual development? The soul-making theodicy seems to work better for some forms of suffering than others. The greater good defense proposes that what appears to us as unnecessary suffering might serve purposes we cannot comprehend. From a divine perspective that encompasses all of history and eternity, events that seem tragic might contribute to a greater good that finite human minds cannot grasp. This defense draws on the recognition that human knowledge and perspective are inherently limited. We see only small pieces of a vast cosmic tapestry and cannot judge the overall pattern from our narrow vantage point. What seems like meaningless suffering might play a crucial role in a divine plan that extends far beyond our understanding. However, this defense raises troubling questions about the nature of divine goodness. If God's goodness is so different from human conceptions of goodness that it allows for what we perceive as gratuitous suffering, in what sense can we call it good at all? The defense risks making divine goodness so mysterious as to be meaningless. Some theologians propose the constraint defense, arguing that even omnipotence might face logical limitations. Perhaps God cannot create a world with free creatures that never choose evil, just as God cannot create square circles or married bachelors. From this perspective, the existence of evil doesn't challenge divine power, but reveals the logical constraints within which even omnipotence must operate. This approach preserves God's goodness by suggesting that the divine faces genuine trade-offs. A world with free creatures capable of love necessarily includes the possibility of hatred. A world with natural laws that support life necessarily includes the possibility of natural disasters. God chooses the best possible world given these constraints, even though that world includes suffering. The skeptical theist response takes a different approach, arguing that human beings are simply incapable of judging divine purposes. Our cognitive limitations, temporal perspective, and moral understanding are so constrained compared to divine knowledge that we cannot reasonably expect to comprehend the reasons for suffering. From this view, the existence of apparently gratuitous suffering doesn't provide evidence against God's existence, because we lack the capacity to recognize how that suffering might serve divine purposes. This response has both philosophical and practical dimensions. Philosophically, it emphasizes the enormous gap between finite and infinite understanding. Practically, it allows believers to maintain faith despite encountering suffering they cannot explain or justify. Critics argue that skeptical theism undermines the possibility of any positive knowledge about divine attributes. If we cannot trust our moral intuitions about suffering, how can we trust them about divine goodness? The position might preserve belief in God, but at the cost of making that belief essentially contentless. Process theologians offer a radically different solution by reconceptualizing divine power. They argue that God is not omnipotent in the traditional sense, but instead works within and alongside natural processes. God influences the world through persuasion rather than coercion, seeking to maximize value and minimize suffering within the constraints of a dynamic, evolving universe. This approach solves the logical problem of evil by denying one of its premises: that God is omnipotent in the classical sense. If God lacks the power to unilaterally prevent all suffering, then the existence of suffering doesn't contradict divine love. However, this solution comes at the cost of traditional ideas about divine sovereignty and power. The problem of evil has spawned numerous variations and related puzzles. The problem of divine hiddenness asks why a loving God would remain hidden from creatures who seek relationship with the divine. The problem of hell questions how eternal punishment could be compatible with infinite love. The problem of animal suffering challenges theodicies that depend on human spiritual development by pointing to the vast suffering of non-human creatures. Contemporary philosophers have developed increasingly sophisticated versions of the problem. The evidential problem of evil acknowledges that the existence of some evil might be compatible with divine goodness, but argues that the amount and distribution of evil in our world provides strong evidence against the existence of an all-good, all-powerful God. The problem of evil has profound practical implications beyond its theoretical interest. It shapes how people understand their suffering, how they relate to religious faith, and how they construct meaning in the face of tragedy. For many, the problem represents not just an intellectual puzzle, but an existential crisis that challenges their deepest beliefs about the nature of reality. Some people find that wrestling with the problem deepens their faith, leading to more nuanced and mature religious beliefs. Others find that the problem undermines their belief in traditional concepts of God, leading them towards skepticism, alternative spiritual frameworks, or entirely secular worldviews. The problem of evil also connects to broader questions about meaning and purpose in human existence. If there is no divine plan that justifies suffering, how do we create meaning in the face of tragedy? How do we maintain hope when confronted with seemingly senseless pain? These questions extend beyond religious belief to touch on fundamental aspects of human psychology and social organization. Perhaps most importantly, the problem of evil reminds us that intellectual puzzles are never merely academic when they touch on human suffering. Behind every theological argument lies a real person facing real pain, seeking real answers to questions that matter deeply. The problem challenges us to hold both intellectual rigor and emotional compassion, to think clearly while remaining sensitive to the human stakes involved. As we wrestle with these ancient questions, we might find that the problem of evil teaches us something unexpected, that the deepest truths about existence might not yield to simple solutions. The persistence of the problem across millennia of sophisticated thinking suggests that reality itself might be more complex, more mysterious, and more ambiguous than our conceptual frameworks can fully capture. Whether one emerges from this exploration with renewed faith, deepened skepticism, or something altogether different, the problem of evil serves as a crucial test of our beliefs about justice, love, power, and meaning. It forces us to confront the gap between the world as we wish it were and the world as we find it, challenging us to respond with both honesty and hope. The unexpected gift paradox. Imagine receiving a phone call on a Sunday evening. The voice on the other end belongs to a dear friend who announces with barely contained excitement, "I have wonderful news. Sometime between Monday and Friday of this week, you're going to receive a surprise gift. But here's the key. It will arrive on a day when you least expect it." You hang up the phone with a smile, already beginning to wonder what this mysterious gift might be and when it might arrive. But as you start to think through the possibilities, something strange happens. Your mind, that remarkable instrument of logic and analysis, begins to work against the very possibility of surprise. The reasoning starts innocently enough. You consider Friday, the last possible day for the gift's arrival. If Thursday evening comes and goes without any gift, you'll know with certainty that it must arrive on Friday. But if you're expecting it on Friday, it can no longer be a surprise. Therefore, Friday is eliminated as a possibility. With Friday ruled out, Thursday becomes the last possible day. But now, the same logic applies. If Wednesday evening passes without a gift, you'll expect it on Thursday, which means Thursday can't be a surprise either. Following this reasoning to its logical conclusion, you systematically eliminate Wednesday, then Tuesday, then Monday. By the end of this mental exercise, it seems impossible for any gift to arrive as a surprise. Yet here's where the paradox reveals its most fascinating aspect. Despite your logical reasoning, if the gift actually arrives on, say, Wednesday morning, you'll likely be genuinely surprised. Your reasoning convinced you that no surprise was possible, so the actual arrival catches you off guard. The gift succeeds in being surprising precisely because your logic told you it couldn't be. This paradox, known variously as the unexpected gift paradox, the surprise test paradox, or the unexpected hanging paradox, exposes a fascinating tension between logical reasoning and lived experience. It demonstrates how our attempts to predict and control outcomes can sometimes undermine the very experiences we're trying to understand. The paradox gained widespread attention in academic circles through the work of philosophers and logicians, who recognized its implications for broader questions about knowledge, prediction, and self-reference. But its roots extend much deeper, touching on fundamental aspects of how consciousness relates to temporality and uncertainty. Consider how the paradox illuminates the nature of expectation itself. What does it mean to expect something? In everyday language, expectation involves a degree of confidence about future events. But the paradox reveals that expectation is more complex than simple prediction. It involves not just beliefs about what will happen, but beliefs about our own beliefs, creating layers of self-reference that can lead to logical tangles. The temporal dimension of the paradox is equally fascinating. The reasoning that eliminates each day as a possibility depends on a specific relationship between knowledge and time. It assumes that we can use our knowledge at one moment to determine what we'll know at future moments. But this assumption might itself be problematic, as it treats knowledge as more static and predictable than it actually is. Let's explore a variation that makes the temporal complexities even clearer. Suppose you receive a more specific prediction. The gift will arrive at a random time between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. on a day this week, and you'll be surprised when it happens. Now the reasoning becomes more complex. Even if you know the gift must arrive on Friday because the week is ending, the exact timing within that day remains uncertain. Can partial uncertainty preserve surprise even when the general time frame is predictable? This variation suggests that surprise might be more resilient than the classical paradox implies. Complete logical elimination of surprise requires complete predictability, but real-world situations rarely offer such certainty. The gift giver might change their mind, delay the delivery, or choose a method of delivery you didn't anticipate. These practical uncertainties can preserve surprise even when abstract logical reasoning suggests it should be impossible. The paradox also connects to deeper questions about the relationship between logic and psychology. The logical argument against surprise seems airtight, yet psychological research shows that people can indeed be surprised by events they've reasoned should be unsurprising. This disconnect reveals the gap between formal logical systems and the way human minds actually process information and experience. Cognitive scientists have identified numerous ways that human reasoning deviates from formal logic. We engage in satisficing rather than optimizing, meaning we often settle for solutions that are good enough rather than pursuing perfect logical consistency. We're influenced by emotions, social contexts, and cognitive biases that can override pure logical reasoning. These flaws in human reasoning might actually be features that preserve our capacity for surprise and wonder. The paradox takes on additional dimensions when we consider its social aspects. The surprise depends not just on logical reasoning but on trust between the gift giver and recipient. If you trust your friend to follow through on their promise, you might not engage in the logical reasoning that eliminates surprise. Conversely, if you doubt their reliability, you might dismiss the entire scenario, again preserving the possibility of surprise if the gift actually arrives. Game theory provides another lens for understanding the paradox. If both the gift giver and recipient are rational actors trying to optimize their outcomes, the situation becomes a strategic interaction where each party's reasoning must account for the other's reasoning. The gift giver, knowing that the recipient will engage in the logical reasoning that eliminates surprise, might deliberately violate the stated conditions to preserve surprise. This creates a kind of recursive reasoning where each party tries to outthink the other. The paradox has practical implications that extend far beyond hypothetical gifts. Consider its relevance to strategic planning in business or military contexts. If a competitor knows you're planning a surprise attack or product launch, and they know they know, the entire strategic calculation changes. The logic of the surprise paradox helps explain why successful surprises often require not just secrecy, but misdirection and the violation of apparent logical patterns. Educational contexts provide another practical application. Teachers often announce surprise quizzes or tests, creating a similar logical structure. Students might reason that a surprise test can't occur on the last possible day because they'd expect it then. But this reasoning can itself be surprising when teachers violate its assumptions or when students fail to follow the logic consistently. The paradox also illuminates the role of attention and memory in shaping experience. Even if you've logically reasoned that a gift should arrive on a particular day, you might become absorbed in other activities and temporarily forget your reasoning. This lapse in attention can restore the possibility of surprise, suggesting that surprise depends not just on logical knowledge, but on the active maintenance of that knowledge in consciousness. Philosophers have proposed various solutions to the paradox, each highlighting different aspects of the problem. Some argue that the paradox reveals the limits of self-referential reasoning. When our reasoning becomes too recursive, when we think about thinking, it can create logical loops that don't correspond to reality. Others suggest that the paradox demonstrates the importance of distinguishing between different types of knowledge. Knowing that a gift will arrive is different from knowing when it will arrive, which is different from knowing that you know when it will arrive. These epistemic distinctions might resolve the paradox by showing that complete surprise, eliminating knowledge, is harder to achieve than the simple formulation suggests. Still others propose that the paradox reveals fundamental features of temporality and consciousness. Our experience of time is not the linear, predictable sequence that logical reasoning assumes. Instead, it's characterized by discontinuities, surprises, and emergent properties that resist complete logical control. From this perspective, the paradox illustrates the limits of applying timeless logical reasoning to temporal phenomena. The paradox connects to broader philosophical questions about determinism and free will. If the future is completely determined by present conditions, then perfect knowledge of those conditions should enable perfect prediction, eliminating all surprise. But the paradox suggests that even in a deterministic universe, the recursive nature of self-aware consciousness can preserve surprise and unpredictability. Modern physics adds another layer of complexity to these questions. Quantum mechanics suggests that certain events are fundamentally random rather than merely unpredictable due to incomplete information. If quantum effects influence human decision-making, then perfect prediction might be impossible even in principle, preserving space for genuine surprise regardless of logical reasoning. The information-theoretic aspects of the paradox are equally fascinating. Surprise is closely related to information content. Events that are highly predictable carry little information, while surprising events carry more. The paradox suggests that the very act of reasoning about surprise might change the information content of future events, creating a kind of observer effect in the realm of logic and epistemology. As we grapple with the unexpected gift paradox, we encounter fundamental questions about the nature of knowledge, time, and consciousness. The paradox reveals that even seemingly simple scenarios can contain deep complexities when subjected to rigorous analysis. It reminds us that logical reasoning, while powerful, has limits, especially when applied to phenomena that involve self-reference, temporality, and consciousness. Perhaps most importantly, the paradox preserves a space for wonder in an increasingly analyzed and predictable world. It suggests that surprise, creativity, and genuine novelty might be more resilient than our logical frameworks predict. In a world where big data and artificial intelligence promise to make everything predictable, the unexpected gift paradox offers a reassuring reminder that mystery and surprise might be ineradicable features of conscious existence. The paradox teaches us to hold our logical reasoning lightly, recognizing its power while acknowledging its limits. It invites us to remain open to surprise, even when our reasoning suggests it's impossible. In doing so, it preserves space for the unexpected gifts that make life rich, meaningful, and endlessly fascinating. The drinker's paradox. Picture a dimly lit tavern on a foggy evening. The kind of establishment where strangers become philosophers over shared drinks and heated debates spark over the most abstract questions. The air is thick with pipe smoke and passionate discourse. In one corner, a group of patrons argues about mathematics. In another, they debate the nature of justice. Tonight, however, the conversation has turned to a seemingly absurd claim that has silenced even the most argumentative customers. Someone has just declared, "In this very bar, there exists at least one person such that if that person drinks, then everyone else in the bar drinks as well." The statement hangs in the air like a challenge to common sense. How could one person's drinking behavior control everyone else's? Yet, surprisingly, this bizarre claim is not only possibly true, it's necessarily true according to the rigid laws of logic. This is the essence of the drinker's paradox, a logical puzzle that demonstrates how formal reasoning can lead to conclusions that seem to violate our everyday understanding of cause and effect. The paradox isn't really about drinking, of course. It's about the strange world of logical implication and how our mathematical systems can generate truths that feel alien to human experience. To understand why this seemingly absurd statement must be true, we need to delve into the mechanics of logical implication. In formal logic, a statement of the form, "if A then B," is considered true in all cases, except when A is true and B is false. This might seem like a technical detail, but it has profound consequences for how we understand logical truth. Let's examine the tavern scenario more carefully. The claim states that there exists someone such that if that person drinks, then everyone drinks. Now imagine we survey the bar and find that everyone is already drinking. In this case, we can point to any patron and truthfully say, if this person drinks, then everyone drinks, because everyone is indeed drinking. The implication holds regardless of whether that particular person's drinking caused everyone else to drink. But what if not everyone in the bar is drinking? Perhaps some patrons are nursing soft drinks or have sworn off alcohol entirely. Here's where the logic becomes counterintuitive. Consider one of the non-drinkers. Let's call him Thomas. We can truthfully say, if Thomas drinks, then everyone drinks. How can this be true when Thomas manifestly isn't drinking and everyone manifestly isn't drinking? The answer lies in understanding how logical implication works. Since Thomas isn't drinking, the condition "Thomas drinks" is false. In logic, when the condition of an implication is false, the entire implication is automatically considered true, regardless of what the consequence claims. This isn't because Thomas's drinking would actually cause everyone to drink, but because the logical structure makes the statement vacuously true. This concept of vacuous truth is central to understanding the drinker's paradox. A statement is vacuously true when its condition is never met, making it impossible to find a counterexample. It's like saying, all unicorns in this room are purple. A statement that's technically true because there are no unicorns in the room to serve as counterexamples. The paradox reveals a fundamental disconnect between logical truth and causal truth. In logic, if P then Q doesn't require any causal connection between P and Q. It simply describes a relationship between truth values. In contrast, our everyday reasoning typically assumes that if-then statements describe causal relationships, or at least meaningful dependencies between events. Consider how this disconnect manifests in other contexts. We could truthfully say, if the moon is made of cheese, then 2 + 2 = 4. This statement is logically true because the moon isn't made of cheese, making the condition false, and 2 + 2 does equal 4, making the consequence true. Yet the statement feels meaningless because there's no connection between lunar composition and arithmetic facts. The drinker's paradox illustrates this same principle, but packages it in a way that seems to describe a social scenario. Our minds naturally interpret statements about people's behavior as claims about psychology, social influence, or causal relationships. When logic generates statements that mimic these familiar patterns while operating according to different rules, the result feels paradoxical. This tension between logical and psychological reasoning appears throughout mathematics and philosophy. Consider the mathematical statement, for all x, if x is both even and odd, then x equals 17. This statement is mathematically true because no number can be both even and odd, making the condition impossible to satisfy. Yet the statement seems to claim something meaningful about numbers and arithmetic. The paradox also highlights the role of quantifiers in logical reasoning. The original statement claims that there exists someone with the specified property. This existential claim is satisfied as long as we can find one person who fits the description. Whether that person actually has any causal influence over others' drinking behavior is irrelevant to the logical truth of the statement. Existential quantification often leads to counterintuitive results in formal logic. Consider the statement, there exists a person such that if that person is happy, then everyone is happy. Logic tells us this statement must be true, but finding the specific person requires understanding the logical structure rather than identifying genuine causal agents of universal happiness. The drinker's paradox connects to deeper questions about the relationship between mathematical reasoning and empirical reality. Mathematics provides powerful tools for modeling and understanding the world, but mathematical truths don't always correspond directly to physical or social facts. The paradox reminds us that logical systems operate according to their own internal rules, which may or may not align with our intuitive understanding of how the world works. This disconnect becomes particularly relevant in an age of artificial intelligence and automated reasoning. Computer systems that process natural language must navigate the gap between logical truth and contextual meaning. A system that interprets the drinker's paradox literally might draw bizarre conclusions about social influence and drinking behavior, while a system that dismisses it entirely might miss important logical relationships. The paradox also illuminates the challenges of translating between formal and natural languages. When we express logical relationships in everyday language, we often import assumptions about causation, intention, and social reality that aren't present in the formal system. This translation process can create confusion about what statements actually mean and what they imply about the world. Philosophers have used the drinker's paradox to explore questions about truth, meaning, and the foundations of logic itself. Some argue that the paradox reveals problems with classical logic, suggesting that our formal systems generate too many true statements that lack meaningful content. Others contend that the paradox simply demonstrates the need for careful distinction between logical truth and other types of truth claims. The paradox has practical implications for how we understand argument and persuasion in everyday life. Politicians, advertisers, and other communicators sometimes exploit the gap between logical validity and meaningful content, crafting statements that are technically true but misleading. Understanding paradoxes like the drinker's paradox can help us become more sophisticated consumers of logical arguments. Educational contexts provide another arena where the paradox proves relevant. Students learning formal logic often struggle with the disconnect between logical truth and intuitive reasoning. The drinker's paradox serves as a vivid example of how mathematical systems can generate unexpected results, helping students develop more nuanced understanding of logical reasoning. The paradox also connects to contemporary debates about the nature of computation and artificial intelligence. As we develop systems that can process logical arguments and generate proofs, we must grapple with questions about when logical truth corresponds to meaningful truth. The drinker's paradox illustrates how formal systems can generate statements that are logically valid but practically meaningless. Game theory provides another lens for examining the paradox. If we interpret the tavern scenario as a strategic interaction where people's drinking decisions influence others, the logical structure might miss crucial aspects of how social influence actually operates. Real social situations involve psychology, emotion, and complex feedback loops that formal logic abstracts away. Cross-cultural perspectives add yet another dimension to understanding the paradox. Different cultures have varying approaches to logical reasoning and different assumptions about causation and social influence. The drinker's paradox might feel more or less paradoxical depending on one's cultural background and the logical traditions one has internalized. The paradox ultimately teaches us humility about the relationship between human reasoning and formal logical systems. While logic provides powerful tools for analysis and reasoning, it operates according to rules that sometimes conflict with our intuitive understanding of the world. Recognizing these conflicts doesn't require abandoning logic, but rather developing more sophisticated appreciation for its strengths and limitations. As we navigate an increasingly complex world filled with logical arguments, statistical claims, and automated reasoning systems, the drinker's paradox reminds us to distinguish between different types of truth. Logical truth, empirical truth, psychological truth, and social truth operate according to different rules and serve different purposes in human life. The paradox invites us to become more thoughtful consumers and producers of logical arguments. It encourages us to ask not just whether statements are logically valid, but whether they're meaningful, relevant, and helpful for understanding the phenomena we care about. In doing so, it helps us develop the kind of intellectual sophistication needed to thrive in a world where logic and life intersect in increasingly complex ways. The island of truth-tellers and liars. On a remote island shrouded in perpetual mist, where ancient olive trees whisper secrets to the wind and marble pathways lead to temples dedicated to forgotten gods, lives a peculiar population divided into two distinct groups. Every inhabitant belongs to one of these categories. They are either truth-tellers, who speak only the truth, or liars, who speak only falsehoods. No middle ground exists, no partial truths, no well-intentioned deceptions, no white lies to spare feelings. Each person is bound by an immutable nature that determines every word they speak. You find yourself washed ashore on this island after a shipwreck, with no memory of how you arrived, but with an urgent need to understand this strange society. Your survival may depend on distinguishing between those who can be trusted and those who cannot. Yet as you attempt your first conversations with the islanders, you quickly discover that this seemingly simple task presents profound logical challenges. The fundamental problem emerges immediately when you approach your first islander and ask the most obvious question: are you a truth teller? Consider what responses you might receive. A truth teller, bound by their nature to speak only truth, would honestly answer yes. But a liar, compelled to speak only falsehoods, would also answer yes. Because claiming to be a truth teller would be a lie, which is exactly what liars do. This realization strikes like a thunderbolt. Direct questions about truthfulness yield identical responses from both groups, making them useless for distinguishing between truth-tellers and liars. The very act of asking someone about their own honesty creates a logical structure that prevents meaningful differentiation. You've encountered your first taste of the deep logical puzzles that govern life on this mysterious island. But logic, that most powerful tool of human reasoning, offers more sophisticated approaches to this challenge. The key lies in constructing questions that force truth-tellers and liars to give different answers, even when both are trying to appear truthful, or both are constrained by their natures. Imagine you encounter two islanders standing together. Let's call them Elena and Marcus. You devise a clever strategy. You ask Elena, "What would Marcus say if I asked him whether you are a truth-teller?" This question creates a logical structure that compels truth-tellers and liars to respond differently, regardless of what type of person Marcus might be. Let's trace through the logic carefully. If Eleanor is a truth-teller, she will honestly report what Marcus would say. If Marcus is also a truth-teller, he would truthfully say that Eleanor is a truth-teller, and Eleanor would honestly report this. But if Marcus is a liar, he would falsely claim that Eleanor is a liar, and Eleanor would honestly report this false claim. Now consider the case where Elena is a liar. She must lie about what Marcus would say. If Marcus is a truth-teller, he would honestly say that Elena is a liar, but Elena must lie about this and claim that Marcus would call her a truth teller. If Marcus is also a liar, he would falsely claim that Elena is a truth teller, but Elena must lie about this and say that Marcus would call her a liar. Through this complex, logical dance, you can determine Elena's nature by analyzing the pattern of her response. The question forces truth tellers and liars into different logical positions, creating a method for distinguishing between them despite their initial identical responses to direct questions. This breakthrough illuminates a profound principle. Solving the truth teller and liar puzzle requires abandoning direct approaches in favor of indirect, self-referential questions that exploit the logical relationships between different statements. The solution emerges not from trying to get islanders to reveal their nature directly, but from creating logical structures where their nature manifests through the patterns of their responses. The island puzzle becomes even more intricate when you encounter larger groups of islanders. Imagine walking into a village square where 5 people are engaged in animated conversation. How do you determine which are truth tellers and which are liars when you can't rely on direct questioning? The challenge requires systematic, logical reasoning that builds understanding gradually through multiple interactions. One approach involves using what logicians call bootstrapping, starting with uncertain information and gradually building toward greater certainty. You might begin by asking one person what another person would say about a third person's nature. While this doesn't immediately reveal everyone's type, it creates logical constraints that limit the possible combinations. By asking multiple such questions and tracking the patterns of responses, you can eventually determine everyone's nature through process of elimination. The puzzle also reveals fascinating insights about the nature of truth itself. In the world of the island, truth becomes a logical property rather than a correspondence to reality. Truth tellers aren't necessarily wise, well-informed, or morally good. They simply happen to be incapable of making false statements. Similarly, liars aren't necessarily malicious or deceptive in intent. They're simply bound by a nature that compels them to make false statements. This abstraction helps us understand how logical systems can operate independently of the psychological and moral dimensions we usually associate with truth and falsehood. The island creates a pure logical environment where questions of motivation, knowledge, and intention become irrelevant to the fundamental structure of the puzzle. The truth teller and liar puzzle has profound implications for understanding communication and epistemology in the real world. While we rarely encounter people who are absolutely truthful or absolutely deceptive, we do navigate situations where we must assess the reliability of information sources. The logical principles illustrated by the island puzzle provide tools for these more nuanced real-world challenges. Consider how these principles apply to evaluating news sources, political statements, or expert testimony. While real-world information sources aren't perfectly reliable or unreliable, we can still use logical reasoning to cross-reference claims, identify inconsistencies, and build more confident assessments of truthfulness. The island puzzle teaches us to look for patterns and relationships between statements rather than relying on isolated claims. The puzzle also illuminates the role of self-reference in logical reasoning. Many of the most effective questions for distinguishing truth tellers from liars involve asking people to make statements about what other people would say about them. This creates multiple layers of reference that can be analyzed logically, even when individual layers remain ambiguous. Self-reference appears throughout mathematics, philosophy, and computer science as a source of both power and paradox. The island puzzle demonstrates how self-referential structures can be harnessed to extract information from seemingly intractable situations. This principle has applications in everything from cryptography to artificial intelligence, where systems must often reason about their own reasoning processes. The temporal dimension of the puzzle adds another layer of complexity. If you encounter the same islanders repeatedly over time, their consistent behavior patterns provide additional evidence about their nature. A person who always makes statements that turn out to be true is likely a truth teller, while someone whose statements consistently prove false is probably a liar. This longitudinal approach complements the logical techniques for immediate assessment. However, the puzzle also reveals the limits of logical reasoning when applied to human behavior. Real people are neither perfectly truthful nor perfectly deceptive. They have complex motivations, varying degrees of knowledge, and different relationships to truth depending on context. The clean logical structure of the island puzzle doesn't directly translate to the messy realities of human communication. Modern variations of the puzzle introduce additional complexity by including random types. People who sometimes tell the truth and sometimes lie according to no discernible pattern. These variations challenge even more sophisticated logical reasoning and require statistical approaches alongside pure logic. They better approximate real-world situations where people's relationship to truth is complex and contextual. The puzzle has inspired extensive research in computer science, particularly in areas related to distributed computing and Byzantine fault tolerance. When computer systems must coordinate despite the possibility that some components might be malfunctioning or compromised, they face challenges analogous to the truth-teller and liar puzzle. The logical techniques developed for the island puzzle have practical applications in designing robust computer networks. Artificial intelligence systems also encounter versions of this puzzle when processing information from multiple sources of varying reliability. Natural language processing systems must often assess the credibility of different information sources and reconcile conflicting claims. The principles illustrated by the island puzzle provide foundational approaches for these challenges. The educational value of the truth-teller and liar puzzle extends beyond its logical content. Working through the puzzle develops crucial critical thinking skills, including the ability to analyze complex logical relationships, resist the temptation to make assumptions, and approach problems systematically. These skills transfer to many domains where careful reasoning is essential. The puzzle also demonstrates the importance of precise language and clear definitions. The clean logical structure depends on the absolute nature of the truth-teller and liar categories. Real-world applications require similar precision in defining terms and conditions, even when the reality being modeled is more complex and ambiguous. Cultural perspectives on truth and deception add fascinating dimensions to the puzzle. Different cultures have varying tolerances for indirect communication, contextual truth, and strategic ambiguity. The island puzzle's emphasis on absolute truth and falsehood reflects particular cultural assumptions about communication that might not apply universally. Philosophical traditions have long debated the nature of truth itself, whether truth corresponds to objective reality, coheres with other beliefs, or serves pragmatic functions in human life. The island puzzle sidesteps these deeper questions by defining truth purely in terms of logical consistency, but it implicitly raises questions about what we mean when we call statements true or false. Game theory provides another lens for analyzing the puzzle. If we consider the interactions between investigators and islanders as strategic games, we can analyze optimal strategies for both revealing and concealing information. This perspective adds psychological realism to the logical structure, considering how rational agents might behave in such scenarios. The puzzle ultimately teaches us that logical reasoning can provide powerful tools for navigating uncertainty and deception. But these tools require careful application and clear understanding of their limitations. The clean, logical world of the island provides insights that can inform our approach to more complex real-world challenges, but always with the recognition that reality rarely conforms to such tidy categories. As you imagine yourself finally mastering the logical principles needed to navigate the island successfully, you might reflect on how this strange place has changed your understanding of truth, communication, and reasoning itself. The island serves as a laboratory for exploring the fundamental structures of logic and language, offering insights that extend far beyond its misty shores into the complexities of human communication and understanding. The Epimenides paradox. In the ancient Mediterranean, where philosophers gathered in marble courtyards and ideas flowed as freely as wine, a curious figure emerged who would inadvertently create one of logic's most enduring puzzles. Epimenides, a poet and philosopher from the island of Crete, made a statement so deceptively simple that it would confound thinkers for millennia. All Cretans are liars. The statement seems straightforward enough. A man from Crete making a claim about the character of his fellow islanders. Perhaps he had grown frustrated with the political machinations of his homeland. Or maybe he was indulging in the kind of self-deprecating humor that deflects criticism. But as soon as philosophers began examining this seemingly innocuous claim, they discovered something that would shake the foundations of logical reasoning itself. The problem emerges when we ask a simple question. Is Epimenides telling the truth? If he is telling the truth, then his statement that all Cretans are liars must be accurate. But if all Cretans are liars, and Epimenides is himself a Cretan, then he must be a liar. And if he's a liar, then his statement cannot be true. But if his statement isn't true, then not all Cretans are liars, which means some Cretans, possibly including Epimenides himself, might tell the truth, which would make his statement possibly true after all. This dizzying logical loop captures the essence of what we now call the Epimenides paradox, also known as the liar paradox. It represents a fundamental challenge to our understanding of truth, language, and logical reasoning. The paradox creates a situation where a statement seems to undermine its own truth value, generating an endless cycle of contradiction that resists resolution. To understand the full implications of this paradox, let's consider a more direct version. This statement is false. If the statement is true, then it accurately describes itself as false, which would make it false. But if it's false, then its claim about being false is incorrect, which would make it true. The statement traps us in an infinite loop where truth becomes falsehood and falsehood becomes truth. This self-referential quality is crucial to understanding why the paradox is so troubling. Most statements refer to things outside themselves. The sky is blue refers to the color of the sky. It's raining refers to current weather conditions. But paradoxical statements, like Epimenides, create a logical mirror where the statement reflects back on itself, creating an unstable system that cannot settle into a consistent truth value. The paradox reveals deep questions about the nature of language and meaning. Our everyday language allows us to construct self-referential statements with apparent ease, but these constructions can create logical structures that seem to violate the basic principles of rational thought. This raises fundamental questions about whether natural language is logically consistent, or whether it contains inherent contradictions that undermine systematic reasoning. Philosophers and logicians have proposed numerous solutions to the Epimenides paradox, each illuminating different aspects of the problem while raising new questions. One approach involves distinguishing between different levels of language: object language and meta-language. From this perspective, statements about truth and falsehood operate at a different logical level than the statements they describe, preventing the problematic self-reference that creates the paradox. This hierarchical approach suggests that when Epimenides says all Cretans are liars, he's making a meta-statement about the truth value of statements made by Cretans, rather than a direct statement that can be evaluated for truth or falsehood. The paradox dissolves because the statement and its evaluation operate at different logical levels, preventing the self-referential loop. However, this solution comes with its own complications. It requires us to carefully categorize statements according to their logical level, and it's not always clear how to apply this categorization to natural language. Moreover, the solution seems to limit the expressive power of language by restricting self-reference, which plays important roles in human communication beyond creating paradoxes. Another approach involves embracing three-valued logic, where statements can be true, false, or neither, undefined. From this perspective, self-referential paradoxical statements simply lack a truth value rather than having contradictory truth values. This statement is false would be classified as undefined or meaningless rather than true or false. Three-valued logic provides a clean resolution to the paradox, but requires abandoning the classical principle that every meaningful statement must be either true or false. This abandonment has far-reaching implications for logical reasoning and mathematics, potentially requiring fundamental revisions to systems of thought that have proven remarkably successful in understanding the world. Some philosophers have proposed that the paradox reveals problems with the classical notion of truth itself. They argue that truth is not a simple property that statements possess or lack, but rather a more complex relationship between language, reality, and context. From this perspective, the paradox emerges from oversimplified assumptions about how truth works, rather than from genuine logical contradictions. The deflationary approach to truth suggests that saying a statement is true adds nothing substantial to the statement itself. Snow is white, and it is true that snow is white convey the same information. This approach attempts to dissolve the paradox by arguing that self-referential statements about truth don't actually say anything meaningful beyond what they appear to say. However, critics point out that the deflationary approach might eliminate too much. Truth seems to play important roles in human reasoning and communication that can't be easily dismissed. Moreover, the approach might simply push the paradox to a different level rather than genuinely resolving it. The paradox has evolved beyond its ancient origins to influence modern mathematics, computer science, and philosophy of language. In the early 20th century, mathematicians discovered that similar self-referential paradoxes could emerge within formal mathematical systems, leading to foundational crises that required complete reconceptualization of mathematical reasoning. Russell's paradox, which asks whether the set of all sets that don't contain themselves contains itself, follows the same logical structure as the Epimenides paradox. This mathematical version revealed that naive approaches to set theory generated contradictions, leading to the development of more sophisticated axiomatic systems that carefully restrict self-reference. The paradox also appears in computer science, where programs must sometimes reason about their own behavior or the behavior of other programs. The halting problem. The question of whether it's possible to determine if an arbitrary program will eventually stop running has connections to self-referential paradoxes. These connections reveal deep limits to what can be computed or determined algorithmically. Modern formal logic has developed sophisticated tools for handling self-reference while avoiding paradox. Tarski's semantic theory provides a framework for discussing truth within formal languages while maintaining logical consistency. These developments represent genuine progress in understanding the logical structure of language and reasoning, even if they don't completely eliminate the puzzles raised by the Epimenides paradox. The paradox continues to influence contemporary philosophy of language and mind. Questions about how minds can represent their own mental states, how language can refer to itself, and how conscious systems can be self-aware all connect to the logical puzzles first identified by Epimenides over 2 millennia ago. Cognitive scientists study how human minds handle self-referential reasoning in practice. While people can generate paradoxical statements like, "This statement is false," they don't typically become paralyzed by the logical contradictions these statements create. This suggests that human reasoning might operate according to principles that are more flexible or contextual than formal logical systems. The practical implications of the Epimenides paradox extend into areas like law, politics, and ethics. Legal systems must sometimes deal with self-referential rules or laws that refer to their own application. Constitutional interpretation involves questions about how legal texts should be understood, including how they should be understood by future interpreters reading those very interpretations. Political discourse often involves statements that refer to their own truth or falsehood. When politicians claim that their opponents always lie, or when they assert that their own statements should be trusted, they create logical structures reminiscent of the Epimenides paradox. Understanding these structures can help citizens evaluate political claims more thoughtfully. The paradox also illuminates aspects of human psychology and social interaction. People routinely make statements about their own honesty or reliability, creating mild versions of the Epimenides situation. While these don't typically generate logical contradictions, they do reveal the complex relationship between self-knowledge, self-presentation, and social trust. Cultural and linguistic variations add fascinating dimensions to the paradox. Different languages handle self-reference differently, and different cultures have varying tolerances for paradox and contradiction. Some philosophical traditions embrace paradox as pointing toward deeper truths that transcend logical analysis, while others view paradox as a sign of confused thinking that should be eliminated. Eastern philosophical traditions have often been more comfortable with paradox than Western traditions. Zen koans deliberately create paradoxical situations designed to break through conventional logical thinking. From this perspective, the Epimenides paradox might be seen not as a problem to be solved, but as a pointer toward the limits of conceptual thought. The paradox raises profound questions about the relationship between language and reality. Does the existence of self-referential paradoxes reveal flaws in language that should be corrected? Or does it point toward fundamental features of how symbolic systems relate to the world they describe? This question connects to broader debates about whether logic discovers truths about reality or constructs useful tools for organizing human thought. Modern developments in artificial intelligence have given new relevance to the Epimenides paradox. As AI systems become more sophisticated, they increasingly encounter situations where they must reason about their own reasoning processes or evaluate their own outputs. Understanding how to handle self-reference without falling into paradox becomes a practical engineering challenge with real-world consequences. Machine learning systems that update their own parameters or modify their own code-face versions of the Epimenides paradox. If a system claims that its own claims are unreliable, how should it, or we, evaluate that claim? These questions are no longer purely academic, but have implications for the development of trustworthy AI systems. The paradox also connects to contemporary debates about truth and knowledge in democratic societies. In an era of competing information sources and claims about fake news, the logical structure of self-referential claims about truth and falsehood becomes politically and socially relevant. Understanding these structures can help citizens navigate complex information environments more effectively. Social media platforms must grapple with versions of the Epimenides paradox when users make claims about the platform's own truthfulness or reliability. When someone posts, "Everything on this platform is false," the platform faces questions about how to evaluate and potentially moderate such claims. The paradox reveals the complexity underlying apparently simple decisions about content moderation and fact-checking. The educational implications of the Epimenides paradox are equally significant. Teaching students to recognize and analyze self-referential paradoxes develops critical thinking skills that apply far beyond formal logic. Students learn to identify assumptions, trace the implications of arguments, and recognize when reasoning becomes circular or self-undermining. The paradox also serves as an excellent introduction to the philosophy of language and the nature of meaning. By working through the logical puzzles it creates, students gain appreciation for the complexity underlying everyday language use and the challenges involved in precise communication and reasoning. Contemporary neuroscience adds another dimension to understanding the paradox. Brain imaging studies of people reasoning through self-referential paradoxes reveal patterns of neural activity that differ from normal logical reasoning. This research might eventually illuminate why human minds can generate paradoxical statements without becoming trapped by them in the way that formal logical systems do. The paradox ultimately teaches us humility about the power and limits of logical reasoning. While logic provides essential tools for understanding the world and evaluating arguments, it also generates puzzles that resist easy resolution. This doesn't undermine the value of logical thinking, but rather enriches our understanding of how reasoning operates in complex domains. The Epimenides paradox reminds us that language, thought, and reality are more complex than they initially appear. The simple statement, "All Cretans are liars," opens doorways into fundamental questions about truth, meaning, and the nature of rational thought itself. While we may never fully resolve the paradox, grappling with it deepens our appreciation for the remarkable complexity underlying even the simplest forms of human communication and reasoning. As we continue our philosophical journey, the Epimenides paradox serves as a reminder that some of the most profound puzzles emerge from the intersection of language and logic. It challenges us to think carefully about how we use words, how we understand truth, and how we navigate the self-referential structures that appear throughout human thought and communication. The two envelopes problem. Picture yourself in an elegant study, perhaps in a Victorian mansion, where dust motes dance in shafts of afternoon sunlight, streaming through tall windows. The mahogany desk before you holds two sealed envelopes, each containing a sum of money. The elderly gentleman who has invited you here, let's call him Professor Hartwell, explains the rules with precise measured words that carry the weight of mathematical certainty. One envelope contains exactly twice as much money as the other, he states, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. You may choose either envelope, but once you've selected one, I'll offer you the opportunity to switch to the other. The question, my dear friend, is whether you should accept that offer. At first glance, this scenario seems to present a simple choice with clear probabilities. Before you open either envelope, both seem equally likely to contain the larger amount. Switching should offer no advantage. It's essentially a 50-50 proposition with no rational basis for preferring one option over the other. But then Professor Hartwell adds a wrinkle that transforms this simple game into one of philosophy's most perplexing puzzles. You may, if you wish, open your chosen envelope before deciding whether to switch. This seemingly helpful addition creates a logical trap that has ensnared some of the finest mathematical minds of the past century. Let's imagine you select the envelope on the left and open it to discover $1,000. Now the professor repeats his offer. Would you like to switch to the other envelope? Here's where the paradox begins to reveal its subtle but devastating logic. You reason as follows. The other envelope contains either $500 or $2,000, each possibility equally likely. If it contains $500, switching would cost you $500. If it contains $2,000, switching would gain you $1,000. The expected value of switching is therefore $500 multiplied by 1/2 minus $500 multiplied by 1/2 plus $1,000 multiplied by 1/2. This calculation yields an expected gain of $250, suggesting that switching is advantageous. But this reasoning leads to an absurd conclusion. Regardless of what amount you find in your chosen envelope, the same logic applies. Whether you discover $10 or $10 million, the expected value calculation suggests that switching always offers an advantage. This implies that you should switch from the first envelope to the second, then switch back to the first, then switch again to the second, in an endless cycle of optimization that makes no sense. The paradox exposes a subtle but fundamental error in applying expected value calculations to situations with incomplete information. The mistake lies in treating the probabilities as if they're independent of the amount you actually observe, when in fact these probabilities must be constrained by whatever process was used to fill the envelopes originally. To understand this more clearly, consider how the envelopes might have been prepared. Professor Hartwell must have used some method to determine the amounts. Perhaps he flipped a coin to decide whether to put $100 and $200 in the envelopes, or whether to put $50 and $100. The specific method he used determines the actual probabilities involved in the problem. If Professor Hartwell used a process where he first selected a smaller amount and then created a larger amount by doubling it, the problem has a particular structure. If he selected from a finite range of possible smaller amounts, say, anywhere from $1 to $1,000, then finding $1,000 in your envelope would tell you something definitive about which envelope you've chosen. Alternatively, if Professor Hartwell used a process with an infinite range of possible amounts, the problem takes on a different character entirely. Some probability distributions over infinite ranges lead to paradoxical situations where standard expected value calculations break down or become undefined. The two envelopes problem illustrates a broader challenge in decision theory and probability. How to reason about probabilities when you have incomplete information about the underlying probability distribution. In many real-world situations, we must make decisions without knowing exactly how the alternatives were generated or what constraints apply to the possible outcomes. Consider a parallel situation in investment decisions. You might know that one of two investment opportunities offers returns twice as high as the other, but without knowing how these opportunities were selected or what ranges of returns are possible, you can't calculate meaningful expected values. The two envelopes problem reveals how seductive but flawed reasoning can emerge when we apply mathematical tools without sufficient attention to their underlying assumptions. The paradox also connects to fundamental questions about infinity and mathematical reasoning. Some versions of the problem involve infinite probability distributions that challenge our understanding of how expected values should be calculated. These mathematical subtleties point toward deep questions about the foundations of probability theory and decision-making under uncertainty. Bayesian approaches to the problem focus on how rational agents should update their beliefs based on new information. When you open your envelope and observe a specific amount, this observation should inform your reasoning about the probable contents of the other envelope. However, different assumptions about prior probability distributions lead to different conclusions about whether switching is advantageous. If you assume that all possible amounts are equally likely, a so-called uniform prior, you encounter mathematical difficulties because there's no uniform distribution over all positive real numbers. If you assume that smaller amounts are more likely than larger amounts, you can construct consistent probability distributions, but these lead to different conclusions about the switching strategy. Game theory provides another lens for analyzing the two envelopes problem. If you view the situation as a game between yourself and Professor Hartwell, you might consider what strategy he would use to fill the envelopes and how you should respond. This perspective reveals additional layers of strategic complexity beyond the basic probability calculations. Some game theoretic analyses suggest that the problem has no clear solution because it depends on unstated assumptions about the player's strategies and information. Professor Hartwell might have chosen the amounts specifically to create confusion, or he might have used a random process that favors certain outcomes. Without knowing his approach, you can't determine the optimal strategy. The paradox has practical implications that extend beyond abstract mathematics. Financial markets, insurance decisions, and many other real-world contexts involve similar structures where agents must choose between alternatives without complete information about how those alternatives were generated. Understanding the logical traps illustrated by the two envelopes problem can help people make better decisions in these practical contexts. Psychological research on the problem reveals interesting patterns in how people actually reason about such choices. Many people have strong intuitions about whether switching is advantageous, but these intuitions often conflict with formal mathematical analyses. The gap between intuitive and mathematical reasoning highlights the complexity of human decision-making under uncertainty. Some studies suggest that people's choices in envelope-switching scenarios are influenced by factors like loss aversion, anchoring effects, and other cognitive biases that aren't captured by pure expected value calculations. These psychological factors might actually lead to better decisions in some cases, suggesting that human intuition sometimes incorporates wisdom that formal analysis misses. The problem also raises questions about the nature of rational decision-making itself. If mathematical analysis leads to paradoxical conclusions, should we trust formal reasoning or rely on other approaches? This question connects to broader debates in philosophy about the relationship between rationality, intuition, and practical wisdom. Different philosophical traditions approach this question differently. Utilitarian ethics, which emphasizes maximizing expected outcomes, might suggest following the mathematical analysis despite its counterintuitive implications. Virtue ethics might emphasize the importance of practical wisdom that recognizes the limits of formal analysis. Pragmatic approaches might focus on what works in practice rather than on theoretical consistency. The two envelopes problem belongs to a family of paradoxes that reveal the limits of expected value reasoning. The St. Petersburg paradox, which involves a game with infinite expected value, but which most people wouldn't pay much to play, raises similar questions about when expected value calculations provide reliable guidance for decision-making. These paradoxes suggest that rational decision-making might require more sophisticated frameworks than simple expected value maximization. Alternative approaches include bounded rationality, which recognizes cognitive limitations, satisficing, which focuses on finding good enough solutions rather than optimal ones, and robust decision-making, which emphasizes strategies that work well across a range of possible scenarios. Contemporary research in behavioral economics has developed numerous insights relevant to the two envelopes problem. Prospect theory, which describes how people actually make decisions under risk, incorporates psychological factors like reference point dependence and probability weighting that affect real-world choices. These insights suggest that the rational solution to the envelope problem might depend on psychological as well as mathematical considerations. The digital age has created new contexts where envelope-like problems arise. Online auctions, cryptocurrency investments, and algorithmic trading all involve situations where agents must make decisions about alternatives without complete information about how those alternatives were generated. Understanding the logical structure of the two envelopes problem can inform better approaches to these modern challenges. Artificial intelligence systems face similar challenges when they must make decisions under uncertainty. Machine learning algorithms must often choose between alternatives without complete information about the underlying data generation process. The envelope paradox reveals some of the subtle reasoning challenges that arise in these contexts. The problem also has implications for the design of experiments and data collection procedures. Researchers must often decide how to allocate resources between different investigative approaches without knowing which will prove most valuable. The envelope paradox illustrates how seemingly rational optimization strategies can lead to paradoxical conclusions when applied without sufficient attention to underlying assumptions. Legal and policy contexts provide additional applications of the reasoning patterns illustrated by the envelope problem. Judges must often choose between alternative sentences or remedies without complete information about their comparative effectiveness. Policymakers must allocate resources between different programs without knowing their relative returns. The envelope paradox reveals the complexity underlying these apparently straightforward optimization problems. The educational value of the two envelopes problem extends beyond its mathematical content. Working through the paradox develops critical thinking skills, including the ability to identify unstated assumptions, recognize the limits of formal reasoning, and appreciate the complexity of decision-making under uncertainty. These skills are valuable across many domains of human activity. The problem also serves as an excellent introduction to probability theory and decision analysis. Students working through the envelope paradox encounter fundamental concepts like expected value, conditional probability, and prior distributions in a concrete context that makes their importance clear. The paradox reveals why careful attention to assumptions and definitions is crucial in mathematical reasoning. Philosophy of science perspectives on the envelope problem illuminate broader questions about how mathematical models relate to real-world phenomena. The paradox shows how mathematical tools can generate apparently rigorous conclusions that nonetheless conflict with practical reasoning. This raises questions about when mathematical models provide reliable guidance and when they might mislead. The problem ultimately teaches us humility about the power and limits of rational analysis. While mathematical reasoning provides essential tools for understanding the world and making good decisions, it also can generate puzzles that resist easy resolution. The two envelopes problem reminds us that rational decision-making requires not just mathematical sophistication, but also practical wisdom about when and how to apply formal tools. As we reflect on the elegant study where our journey began, with Professor Hartwell's two envelopes resting quietly on the mahogany desk, we might appreciate how this simple scenario opens doorways into fundamental questions about probability, rationality, and decision-making. The paradox doesn't provide easy answers, but it deepens our understanding of the challenges involved in reasoning under uncertainty. The two envelopes problem stands as a testament to the surprising complexity that can emerge from apparently simple situations. It reminds us that careful reasoning requires attention not just to mathematical techniques, but also to the assumptions and contexts that give those techniques meaning. In navigating a world full of uncertain choices, this paradox offers valuable lessons about the art and science of rational decision-making. The problem of the criterion. In the heart of ancient Alexandria, where the great library once stood as humanity's monument to learning, scholars gathered to debate a question that would prove more treacherous than any labyrinth. How can we know what we know? This seemingly simple inquiry opens into an abyss of logical complexity that has swallowed the certainties of philosophers for over 2 millennia. It is the problem of the criterion, a puzzle so fundamental that it strikes at the very roots of human knowledge and reasoning. Picture yourself as a young scholar entering the library's vast halls for the first time. The scrolls stretching endlessly before you contain the accumulated wisdom of civilizations. Mathematics from Babylon, philosophy from Athens, astronomy from Egypt. But as you reach for your first scroll, a grizzled old philosopher stops you with a penetrating question. How do you know that what you're about to read is true? And more troubling still, how do you know that your method for determining truth is itself reliable? This challenge embodies the problem of the criterion in its most acute form. To evaluate the truth of any claim, we need reliable criteria for distinguishing truth from falsehood. But to establish that our criteria are reliable, we need some way of evaluating their accuracy. And to evaluate their accuracy, we need criteria for evaluation. The circle closes upon itself like a serpent devouring its own tail, creating a logical structure that seems to undermine the very possibility of knowledge. The ancient skeptic Sextus Empiricus articulated this dilemma with devastating clarity. He pointed out that we seem to need 2 things simultaneously: knowledge of what is true and a reliable method for determining what is true. But we cannot acquire either without already possessing the other. To know what is true, we need a criterion for truth. To know that our criterion is reliable, we need to know what is true. We are trapped in a circle from which there seems to be no escape. Consider how this problem manifests in everyday attempts to acquire knowledge. Suppose you want to determine whether a particular news report is accurate. You might check it against other news sources, but this assumes that other sources are more reliable than the original, an assumption that itself requires justification. You might appeal to expert opinion, but this assumes that experts are more likely to be correct than non-experts, another assumption requiring justification. Perhaps you decide to check the report against your own observations or experiences, but this assumes that your senses and memory are reliable, that your interpretation of your experiences is accurate, and that your past experiences are relevant to current claims. Each of these assumptions opens new questions that require their own justification, leading to an endless regress of criteria needing criteria. The problem becomes even more acute when we consider fundamental principles of reasoning itself. Why should we trust logical reasoning? One might argue that logic has proven reliable in the past, but this argument uses logical reasoning to justify logical reasoning, a blatantly circular approach. Alternatively, one might argue that logic is self-evidently correct, but this appeals to intuition or immediate apprehension, which are themselves criteria that require justification. The problem of the criterion reveals a fundamental tension in human knowledge between the demand for justification and the impossibility of ultimate justification. We want our beliefs to be grounded in solid reasons, but any attempt to provide complete justification leads either to circular reasoning, infinite regress, or arbitrary stopping points. Each option seems to undermine the rational foundation we seek to establish. The circular reasoning option occurs when we use a principle to justify itself, or when we employ a chain of reasoning that eventually loops back to its starting point. We see this in many contexts, using scientific methods to validate scientific methods, employing logical principles to defend logical reasoning, or appealing to the reliability of perception to justify our trust in perceptual evidence. While such circular justification seems obviously flawed, it's remarkably difficult to avoid entirely. Even the most sophisticated philosophical and scientific systems contain elements of circularity when examined closely enough. This doesn't necessarily invalidate these systems, but it does raise questions about the nature of justification and whether perfect logical foundation is possible or necessary. The infinite regress option emerges when we demand justification for every principle and reason. Each justification requires further justification, creating an endless chain that never reaches a secure foundation. Why trust this expert? Because they have relevant credentials. Why trust the credentialing institution? Because it has a good track record. Why trust that past performance indicates future reliability? Because inductive reasoning generally works. Why trust inductive reasoning? The questions continue indefinitely. Some philosophers have embraced infinite regress, arguing that justification chains can be infinite without undermining knowledge. This infinitist position suggests that as long as we can always provide some justification when challenged, the impossibility of completing an infinite chain doesn't invalidate our beliefs. Critics respond that infinite justification is psychologically impossible for finite minds and provides no practical guidance for evaluating competing claims. The arbitrary stopping point option involves accepting certain principles or facts without further justification. We might declare certain beliefs to be self-evident, foundational, or basic in ways that don't require external support. This foundationalist approach provides a way to halt the regress of justification, but it does so by essentially giving up on the demand for universal justification. Different versions of foundationalism propose different types of basic beliefs. Empirical foundationalists might argue that immediate sensory experiences are self-justifying. When you experience pain, you can't meaningfully doubt that you're having that experience. Rational foundationalists might propose that certain logical or mathematical truths are self-evident in ways that require no external justification. However, foundationalism faces its own challenges. What makes certain beliefs basic while others require justification? Why should we trust immediate experience or rational intuition more than other sources of belief? These questions suggest that even foundational beliefs might require some form of justification, potentially recreating the very problem foundationalism was meant to solve. The problem of the criterion has profound implications for scientific reasoning, which we often consider the most reliable method for acquiring knowledge about the natural world. Science relies on empirical observation, logical reasoning, and mathematical analysis. But how do we justify our confidence in these methods? Scientific success might be seen as validating scientific methods, but this argument is itself circular, using scientific reasoning to validate scientific reasoning. Moreover, the history of science reveals numerous cases where accepted methods led to false conclusions or where revolutionary advances required abandoning previously reliable approaches. This historical perspective complicates simple appeals to scientific success as justification for scientific methods. If scientific methods can be revised or abandoned, what guarantees their current reliability? The criterion problem also challenges legal and political systems that rely on establishing facts and making rational decisions. Legal procedures for determining guilt or innocence presuppose criteria for evaluating evidence and testimony. But these criteria themselves rest on assumptions about human psychology, the reliability of memory, the interpretation of physical evidence, and numerous other factors that could be questioned. Similarly, democratic decision-making assumes that citizens can evaluate competing claims and make rational choices about policies and candidates. But if the problem of the criterion undermines our confidence in human reasoning generally, it raises questions about the epistemic foundations of democratic governance. How can we trust collective decision-making if individual reasoning is fundamentally problematic? Educational systems face related challenges in determining what knowledge to transmit and how to teach students to think critically. If teachers cannot provide ultimate justification for the methods and content they present, how should they respond to students who demand such justification? The criterion problem suggests that education might need to focus on developing intellectual virtues like curiosity, open-mindedness, and tolerance for uncertainty, rather than on transmitting supposedly certain knowledge. Contemporary epistemology has developed various responses to the problem of the criterion, each offering different perspectives on how to understand knowledge and justification. Coherentist approaches suggest that beliefs are justified not by foundational principles, but by how well they fit together in a coherent system. From this perspective, individual beliefs don't need independent justification, as long as they contribute to an overall coherent worldview. Coherentism avoids both circularity and infinite regress by abandoning the linear model of justification entirely. Instead of requiring beliefs to be justified by other beliefs in a hierarchical structure, coherentism treats justification as a holistic property of entire belief systems. Beliefs are justified by their role in creating and maintaining coherence rather than by their relationship to basic or foundational beliefs. However, coherentism faces its own challenges. Why should coherence be considered a reliable guide to truth? False beliefs can form coherent systems just as easily as true beliefs. Moreover, competing coherent systems might exist, raising questions about how to choose between them. These problems suggest that coherentism might not fully solve the criterion problem, but rather relocate it to questions about the criteria for coherence itself. Pragmatist approaches to the criterion problem focus on the practical consequences of beliefs rather than their theoretical justification. From this perspective, beliefs are valuable not because they can be proven true, but because they work effectively in practice. Scientific theories are useful because they enable successful prediction and control. Moral principles are valuable because they promote human flourishing, and logical rules are important because they facilitate effective reasoning. Pragmatism sidesteps the traditional criterion problem by changing the subject from theoretical justification to practical effectiveness. Instead of asking whether our methods for determining truth are ultimately reliable, pragmatists ask whether our methods serve human purposes effectively. This shift makes the criterion problem less pressing, but raises new questions about how to evaluate practical effectiveness and whether practical success provides any guarantee of theoretical truth. Reliabilist epistemology offers another approach by focusing on the reliability of belief-forming processes rather than on the justification of individual beliefs. From this perspective, beliefs are warranted if they result from processes that generally produce true beliefs, regardless of whether we can justify those processes philosophically. Perception, memory, and reasoning might be considered reliable even if we cannot provide ultimate justification for trusting them. Reliabilism promises to resolve the criterion problem by grounding knowledge in objective features of our cognitive processes rather than in subjective justification. If our belief-forming mechanisms are in fact reliable, then the beliefs they produce constitute knowledge regardless of whether we can prove their reliability. This approach treats the criterion problem as a philosophical puzzle that doesn't undermine the practical reliability of human cognition. Critics of reliabilism point out that it merely pushes the criterion problem to a different level. How do we determine which processes are reliable? What criteria do we use to evaluate reliability? If we use unreliable processes to identify reliable processes, the entire approach becomes circular. These challenges suggest that reliabilism might not fully escape the criterion problem, but rather transform it into questions about the criteria for reliability. Virtue epistemology focuses on the intellectual character of believers, rather than on the justification of beliefs or the reliability of processes. From this perspective, knowledge results from the exercise of intellectual virtues like curiosity, open-mindedness, intellectual humility, and careful reasoning. Beliefs held by intellectually virtuous agents are more likely to constitute knowledge than beliefs held by intellectually vicious agents. This approach shifts attention from the logical structure of justification to the personal qualities that promote good thinking. Instead of seeking ultimate criteria for truth, virtue epistemologists focus on cultivating the character traits that make people better thinkers. This personal approach to the criterion problem emphasizes education and character development rather than philosophical argument. However, virtue epistemology faces questions about which character traits genuinely promote knowledge and how to identify virtuous thinkers. These questions threaten to recreate the criterion problem at the level of intellectual virtue. What criteria do we use to identify intellectual virtues, and how do we justify those criteria? The approach might succeed in making the criterion problem less central to epistemology, but it doesn't necessarily solve it completely. Modern contextualist approaches suggest that knowledge and justification are relative to particular contexts rather than absolute properties of beliefs. What counts as adequate justification in a scientific context might be different from what counts as adequate justification in a legal context or an everyday practical context. This relativity dissolves the criterion problem by denying that there must be universal criteria for knowledge. Contextualism recognizes that human knowledge-seeking activities occur within specific social and practical contexts that shape the standards for evaluation. Scientific communities develop their own criteria for evaluating theories. Legal systems establish their own standards for evaluating evidence, and everyday practical reasoning operates according to its own informal standards. The criterion problem arises only when we demand universal standards that transcend all contexts. This approach offers a pragmatic solution to the criterion problem, but raises new questions about relativism and objectivity. If standards for knowledge are context relative, does this mean that truth itself is relative? How do we evaluate competing contexts or resolve conflicts between them? Contextualism might solve some versions of the criterion problem while creating new challenges about the nature of truth and objectivity. The problem of the criterion ultimately reveals something profound about the human condition. Our quest for knowledge and understanding operates within fundamental limitations that cannot be completely overcome through philosophical analysis. This recognition need not lead to skepticism or despair, but can inspire intellectual humility and appreciation for the remarkable achievements of human knowledge despite its uncertain foundations. The criterion problem teaches us that absolute certainty might be less important than we initially supposed. Humans have developed sophisticated knowledge and technology, created art and literature, and built complex societies without resolving the fundamental epistemological puzzles that philosophers debate. This practical success suggests that the criterion problem, while intellectually fascinating, might not undermine the possibility of knowledge and rational action. Perhaps the most important lesson of the problem of the criterion is that knowledge and reasoning are human activities that cannot be completely separated from human nature, culture, and history. Our criteria for evaluation emerge from our biological evolution, cultural development, and individual experience, rather than from pure logical analysis. Recognizing this embeddedness doesn't invalidate human knowledge, but helps us understand its character and limitations more clearly. The criterion problem invites us to approach knowledge claims with appropriate humility, while remaining committed to careful reasoning and evidence evaluation. It suggests that intellectual virtues like open-mindedness, curiosity, and tolerance for uncertainty might be more important than the impossible quest for absolute certainty. In embracing these virtues, we can continue the ancient human project of understanding ourselves and our world, even without perfect logical foundations. As we leave the great library of Alexandria in our imagination, scrolls of wisdom still beckoning from endless shelves, we carry with us not the certainty we might have hoped to find, but something perhaps more valuable, a deeper appreciation for the complexity and mystery of human knowledge. The problem of the criterion reminds us that the quest for understanding is itself part of what makes us human, even when, perhaps especially when, that quest reveals the limits of human reason. The lottery coincidence. On a warm Tuesday evening in a small suburban town, Margaret Thompson stops at the corner convenience store to purchase a lottery ticket, as she has done every week for the past 15 years. The routine is familiar, selecting the same numbers that represent her children's birthdays, paying the clerk, and tucking the tickets safely into her wallet. She harbors no great expectations. The odds against winning are astronomical, calculated at 1 in 300 million. But this Tuesday is different. When the numbers are announced that evening, Margaret discovers that impossible thing has happened. Her ticket matches perfectly. She has won the jackpot of $450 million. As the reality sinks in, friends and family celebrate with champagne and congratulations. Yet within days, whispers begin to circulate. Comments appear on social media. A local newspaper columnist raises eyebrows with a pointed question. What are the odds that Margaret Thompson won legitimately? This scenario embodies the lottery coincidence paradox, a puzzle that challenges our understanding of probability, suspicion, and the nature of improbable events. The paradox asks a troubling question. When something so unlikely occurs that its probability approaches zero, should we conclude that it happened naturally or that something else? Fraud, manipulation, or systematic bias better explains the outcome. The mathematical reality of lottery odds makes the paradox particularly acute. In a typical large lottery, any individual ticket has roughly a 1 in 300 million chance of winning, a probability so small it defies intuitive comprehension. To put this in perspective, you're more likely to be struck by lightning while being attacked by a shark during a solar eclipse than to win such a lottery with a single ticket. When faced with such astronomical odds, our minds naturally search for alternative explanations. The paradox reveals a fundamental tension between mathematical probability and psychological reasoning. Mathematics tells us that highly improbable events, while unlikely for any specific individual, become virtually certain when millions of people participate. Someone must win the lottery, and from a statistical perspective, Margaret Thompson is just as likely as anyone else to be that someone. The improbability of her specific victory doesn't make it suspicious. It makes it normal within the broader statistical framework. Yet our psychological machinery evolved to detect patterns and anomalies that might signal danger or opportunity. When confronted with highly improbable events, we instinctively seek causal explanations beyond mere chance. This tendency serves us well in many contexts. Unusual patterns often do indicate underlying causes that merit investigation. The challenge lies in distinguishing between genuinely suspicious patterns and the natural occurrence of statistically expected but individually unlikely events. Consider how the paradox manifests in different contexts. If Margaret had won the lottery twice in the same year, our suspicions might be more justified. The probability of winning twice would be roughly 1 in 90 trillion. So unlikely that fraud or systematic error becomes a more plausible explanation than chance. But what about winning once? The paradox forces us to grapple with where we draw the line between acceptable coincidence and suspicious improbability. Real-world examples illuminate this challenge. In 1988, Evelyn Marie Adams won the New Jersey lottery twice within 4 months, earning her a place in record books and widespread suspicion. Statisticians calculated that the odds of any specific person winning twice were approximately 1 in 17 trillion. Yet mathematicians also pointed out that the odds of someone, somewhere in America, winning a state lottery twice within a year were much more reasonable. Perhaps 1 in 30, given the number of lottery players and frequency of drawings. This distinction between specific and general probability lies at the heart of the lottery coincidence paradox. The probability that Margaret Thompson specifically would win is vanishingly small, but the probability that someone would win is essentially certain. Our minds struggle to maintain this distinction, often conflating the improbability of specific outcomes with the implausibility of any unusual outcome occurring. The paradox extends beyond lotteries to challenge our reasoning about unlikely events throughout life. Consider medical diagnoses of rare diseases. When a patient presents with symptoms that match a condition affecting 1 in a million people, doctors must decide whether to pursue expensive testing or attribute the symptoms to more common causes. The rarity of the condition argues against testing, yet someone must be that 1 in a million case. Criminal investigations face similar challenges when evaluating circumstantial evidence. DNA evidence might match a suspect with odds of 1 in several billion, seemingly providing overwhelming proof of guilt. Yet defense attorneys can argue that in a population of hundreds of millions, several people might share the same genetic markers. The lottery coincidence paradox reveals how statistical reasoning intersects with questions of justice and burden of proof. The paradox also appears in scientific research, where extremely unlikely experimental results might indicate either genuine discoveries or systematic errors. When particle physicists detect rare events that occur once in billions of collisions, they must distinguish between new phenomena and equipment malfunctions. The history of science includes both genuine discoveries that initially seemed impossibly improbable and false alarms that wasted significant resources. Financial markets provide another arena where the lottery coincidence paradox plays out daily. Investment managers who achieve extraordinary returns might be genuinely skilled or simply lucky. With thousands of fund managers making investment decisions, some will inevitably achieve remarkable success purely by chance. Distinguishing skill from luck becomes crucial for investors seeking to identify managers likely to continue their success. The rise of big data and algorithmic analysis has made the lottery coincidence paradox more relevant than ever. When computers analyze vast datasets containing millions of variables, they inevitably discover correlations that seem statistically significant but arise from pure chance. Data mining can reveal spurious patterns that appear meaningful, but reflect nothing more than the mathematical certainty that unusual combinations will emerge from large datasets. Social media amplifies the paradox by making unlikely events more visible and memorable. When someone posts about an amazing coincidence, running into their childhood friend in a foreign country, or discovering their Uber driver shares their birthday, these stories spread widely precisely because they seem so improbable. Yet with billions of people having millions of daily interactions, extraordinary coincidences become statistically inevitable rather than genuinely miraculous. The psychology underlying our response to unlikely events reveals deep features of human cognition. Our pattern-seeking minds evolved in environments where unusual events often signaled important information about threats or opportunities. A rustling bush that might indicate a predator, an unusual animal behavior that might predict weather changes, or an unexpected absence of familiar sounds that might suggest danger. These patterns provided survival advantages that shaped our cognitive architecture. This evolutionary heritage creates what psychologists call the conjunction fallacy. Our tendency to perceive specific combinations of events as more probable than they actually are when those combinations fit meaningful narratives. We find it easier to believe that Margaret Thompson won the lottery because she deserved it after years of faithful participation than to accept that pure randomness selected her from millions of equally deserving players. The availability heuristic compounds this effect by making unlikely but memorable events seem more probable than they actually are. Stories about lottery fraud receive extensive media coverage precisely because they're unusual, creating the false impression that fraudulent wins are more common than legitimate ones. Our judgment becomes skewed by the disproportionate attention paid to suspicious cases relative to ordinary wins. Confirmation bias further distorts our reasoning about unlikely events. Once we develop suspicions about a particular outcome, we unconsciously seek evidence that supports those suspicions while dismissing contradictory information. If Margaret Thompson had any connection to lottery officials, no matter how tenuous, this association might seem suspicious, even though millions of people have some indirect connection to state employees. The lottery coincidence paradox also reveals cultural differences in attitudes toward probability and causation. Western scientific thinking emphasizes mechanistic causation and statistical reasoning, making pure randomness an acceptable explanation for unusual events. Other cultural traditions might emphasize fate, karma, or divine intervention as explanations for extraordinary outcomes. These different frameworks lead to varying levels of suspicion about improbable events. Legal systems must grapple with the lottery coincidence paradox when evaluating statistical evidence in court cases. Expert witnesses might testify that certain evidence patterns occur with probability less than 1 in a billion, seemingly providing overwhelming proof of guilt or innocence. Yet courts must consider whether such statistical arguments genuinely prove causation or merely demonstrate that unlikely events sometimes occur. The prosecutor's fallacy illustrates one common error in applying statistical reasoning to legal contexts. This fallacy involves confusing the probability of evidence given innocence with the probability of innocence given evidence. Even if certain evidence would be extremely unlikely if a defendant were innocent, this doesn't necessarily mean the defendant is probably guilty, especially if the prior probability of guilt is very low. Defense attorneys can exploit the lottery coincidence paradox by arguing that their clients are simply unlucky victims of circumstance. If DNA evidence, witness testimony, and physical evidence all point toward guilt, but each piece of evidence individually could occur by chance, the defense might argue that their client represents an extremely unlucky but innocent person who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The pharmaceutical industry faces lottery coincidence challenges when evaluating drug safety and efficacy. Clinical trials might reveal apparent correlations between treatments and outcomes, but distinguishing genuine causal relationships from statistical flukes requires careful analysis. The more endpoints researchers examine, the more likely they are to find spurious correlations that suggest non-existent effects. Regulatory agencies must balance the costs of falsely approving dangerous drugs against the costs of falsely rejecting beneficial ones. The lottery coincidence paradox complicates this balance by making it difficult to determine when unusual trial results reflect genuine effects versus statistical noise. Multiple testing procedures and replication requirements help address these challenges, but they cannot eliminate the fundamental uncertainty. Educational contexts provide another area where the lottery coincidence paradox influences reasoning. When students achieve unexpected test scores, either remarkably high or surprisingly low, educators must decide whether these results reflect genuine ability changes or statistical fluctuations. Standardized testing programs face similar challenges when identifying schools with unusually good or bad performance. The paradox has implications for artificial intelligence systems that must reason about probability and causation. Machine learning algorithms trained on historical data might identify patterns that reflect past coincidences rather than genuine predictive relationships. Distinguishing signal from noise becomes crucial for developing AI systems that make reliable predictions about future events. As AI systems become more sophisticated and process larger data sets, they will inevitably encounter lottery coincidence scenarios where extremely unlikely patterns emerge from the data. Programming these systems to respond appropriately to such patterns requires encoding sophisticated understanding of probability, causation, and the distinction between mathematical possibility and practical plausibility. The rise of automated decision-making systems makes the lottery coincidence paradox practically relevant for millions of people. Credit scoring algorithms, hiring software, and criminal justice risk assessment tools all make decisions based on statistical correlations that might reflect genuine patterns or mere coincidence. Understanding the paradox becomes essential for designing fair and effective automated systems. Contemporary debates about algorithmic bias often involve lottery coincidence reasoning. When automated systems produce discriminatory outcomes, determining whether these results reflect biased training data, flawed algorithms, or statistical coincidence requires sophisticated analysis. The paradox reminds us that unusual patterns in algorithmic outputs don't necessarily indicate intentional bias, though they shouldn't be dismissed without investigation. The lottery coincidence paradox ultimately teaches us humility about our ability to distinguish between chance and causation. While extremely unlikely events deserve scrutiny, they don't automatically warrant suspicion. The mathematical inevitability of improbable occurrences means that someone, somewhere, will always be experiencing events so unlikely they seem impossible. This recognition doesn't mean we should abandon critical thinking about unusual events, but rather that we should apply such thinking more carefully. The paradox suggests several principles for reasoning about improbable occurrences. Consider both specific and general probabilities, account for selection effects and multiple comparisons, remain aware of cognitive biases that distort probability judgments, and seek additional evidence before drawing strong conclusions from isolated unlikely events. The paradox also highlights the importance of statistical literacy in modern society. As data becomes more abundant and analytical tools more powerful, citizens increasingly encounter claims based on statistical reasoning. Understanding the lottery coincidence paradox helps people evaluate such claims more thoughtfully, distinguishing between genuine discoveries and statistical artifacts. Perhaps most importantly, the lottery coincidence paradox reminds us that living in a probabilistic universe means accepting uncertainty and embracing nuance. Perfect knowledge about causation remains elusive, and distinguishing chance from design requires ongoing vigilance. rather than simple formulas. The paradox doesn't provide easy answers, but rather frameworks for thinking more clearly about the complex relationship between probability and reality. As Margaret Thompson navigates her newfound wealth and the accompanying scrutiny, she embodies the human experience of living within probability's strange landscape. Her genuine surprise at winning, her decision to continue working despite her windfall, and her gracious response to skeptics all suggest someone who understands that extraordinary events sometimes happen to ordinary people for no reason beyond the mathematical certainty that someone, somewhere, will always beat impossible odds. The lottery. Coincidence paradox invites us to marvel at the universe's capacity for surprise while maintaining healthy skepticism about our ability to fully comprehend the dance between chance and necessity. In embracing this complexity, we develop more sophisticated appreciation for the remarkable improbability of existence itself, and the equally remarkable fact that we're here to contemplate it. The Sorcerer's Apprentice Syndrome. In the shadowy depths of an ancient tower laboratory, candlelight flickers across walls lined with dusty tomes and bubbling alchemical apparatus. A young apprentice, weary from hours of tedious chores, watches his master's powerful magic with a mixture of awe and envy. The sorcerer departs on urgent business, leaving behind only stern warnings about touching his enchanted implements. But temptation proves stronger than wisdom, and the apprentice reaches for a seemingly simple broom, whispering the magical words he has memorized from careful observation. The broom springs to life with startling vigor, immediately beginning to carry water from the well to fill the laboratory's basins. The apprentice watches with delight as his magical servant performs the mundane task he had dreaded. But as minutes pass, delight transforms into concern, then alarm, then terror. The broom continues its work with mechanical persistence, bringing bucket after bucket of water, even as the basins overflow and flood spreads across the stone floor. Frantically, the apprentice tries to stop his creation, but he lacks the knowledge to reverse the spell. In desperation, he grabs an axe and splits the broom in half, only to watch in horror as both pieces continue working, now doubled in their destructive efficiency. Water rises around his ankles, then his knees, as the enchanted servants pursue their task with mindless determination, oblivious to the chaos they create. This tale, immortalized in Disney's Fantasia and countless retellings, serves as a perfect metaphor for what modern thinkers call the Sorcerer's Apprentice Syndrome, the phenomenon whereby human creations, once set in motion, develop their own momentum and escape the control of their creators. The syndrome captures a fundamental aspect of human innovation, our remarkable ability to create systems more powerful than ourselves, combined with our frequent inability to predict or control their long-term consequences. The Industrial Revolution provides the most dramatic historical example of the Sorcerer's Apprentice Syndrome. When inventors began harnessing steam power and mechanizing production, they intended to reduce human labor and increase prosperity. The transformation succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, creating unprecedented wealth and technological capability. Yet it also unleashed consequences they never anticipated: environmental degradation, urban overcrowding, labor exploitation, and social upheaval that continue to shape our world today. The factory system, like the apprentice's broom, began as a tool to serve human purposes, but gradually developed its own logic and momentum. Competitive pressures forced businesses to prioritize efficiency and profit maximization, often at the expense of worker welfare or environmental protection. The system's internal logic, the imperative to reduce costs and increase output, became a force that shaped human behavior rather than merely responding to human direction. Consider how the automobile transformed society in ways its inventors never intended. Henry Ford envisioned cars as tools to increase individual mobility and freedom. He could hardly have predicted that widespread automobile adoption would reshape urban planning, create suburban sprawl, contribute to climate change, and generate entire industries devoted to insurance, regulation, and accident response. The automobile became not just a tool we use, but a technology that fundamentally altered how we organize space, time, and social relationships. The digital revolution exemplifies the syndrome in even more dramatic fashion. Computer networks began as tools for researchers to share information and resources. The internet emerged from military research into distributed communication systems that could survive nuclear attack. Social media platforms started as ways for friends to stay connected. Yet these technologies have evolved into complex systems that influence political processes, reshape human psychology, and challenge traditional notions of privacy, truth, and social cohesion in ways their creators never anticipated. Facebook provides a particularly striking example. Mark Zuckerberg initially created the platform to help college students connect with each other, a digital version of the printed directories that helped students learn about their classmates. The simple concept of allowing people to share updates and photos with friends has evolved into a global information ecosystem that influences elections, spreads misinformation, affects mental health, and challenges the authority of traditional institutions. The platform's algorithms, designed to maximize user engagement by showing content likely to generate responses, have inadvertently promoted divisive and emotionally charged material. Like the apprentice's broom, these algorithms pursue their programmed objective, increasing engagement. Without understanding or caring about broader consequences for social cohesion or individual well-being, artificial intelligence represents perhaps the most dramatic contemporary example of the sorcerer's apprentice syndrome. Machine learning systems, trained to optimize specific objectives, sometimes develop strategies that technically achieve their goals while violating the spirit of what their creators intended. AI systems designed to play games have discovered exploits that win by manipulating the game environment rather than playing as intended. Recommendation algorithms designed to keep users engaged have learned to exploit psychological vulnerabilities in ways that their creators find ethically troubling. The challenge becomes even more acute as AI systems become more powerful and autonomous. Deep learning systems make decisions through processes so complex that even their creators cannot fully understand or predict their behavior. These systems are beginning to exhibit emergent properties, capabilities that arise from their training but were not explicitly programmed. We are creating digital apprentices that might someday face the same problem as their mythical predecessor: insufficient knowledge to control the forces they have unleashed. Financial markets provide another arena where the sorcerer's apprentice syndrome manifests dramatically. Algorithmic trading systems designed to execute trades faster and more efficiently than human traders now dominate global financial markets. These systems can process information and execute trades in microseconds, operating at speeds that make human oversight practically impossible. The flash crash of 2010 illustrated the potential dangers of this technological apprenticeship. Automated trading systems, responding to market conditions and each other's behavior, created a feedback loop that temporarily erased nearly $1 trillion in market value within minutes. Like the apprentice watching his magical broom spiral out of control, human traders could only observe as their automated systems generated chaos far beyond what any individual algorithm was programmed to do. Climate change represents perhaps the most consequential example of the sorcerer's apprentice syndrome in human history. The Industrial Revolution unleashed the power of fossil fuels to transform human civilization, creating unprecedented prosperity and technological capability. Yet this same transformation set in motion atmospheric changes that now threaten the stability of Earth's climate system. The carbon cycle, once a self-regulating system that maintained atmospheric balance over geological timescales, has been disrupted by human activity in ways that create positive feedback loops. Melting Arctic ice reduces the planet's ability to reflect solar radiation, accelerating warming. Thawing permafrost releases methane and carbon dioxide, further accelerating warming. Rising temperatures increase water vapor in the atmosphere, which traps additional heat. Like the apprentice's multiplying brooms, these feedback mechanisms pursue their own logic, regardless of human intentions or desires. The syndrome appears throughout the history of technology and social innovation. Nuclear weapons, developed to end World War II and provide national security, created new forms of existential risk that continue to threaten human civilization. Antibiotics, discovered to treat bacterial infections, have led to the evolution of antibiotic-resistant bacteria that pose new health challenges. Pesticides, designed to protect crops, have contributed to pollinator decline and ecosystem disruption. Urban planning provides subtler but equally important examples. Highway systems, built to improve transportation, often divided communities and contributed to urban decay. Urban renewal projects, intended to improve living conditions, sometimes destroyed established communities and social networks. Public housing projects, designed to provide affordable homes, sometimes concentrated poverty and created new social problems. The syndrome extends beyond technology to encompass social and political innovations. Democracy, designed to give people control over their governments, can sometimes be manipulated by demagogues or captured by special interests. Market economies, intended to efficiently allocate resources and promote innovation, can generate inequality and instability that threaten social cohesion. Educational systems, created to transmit knowledge and develop human potential, sometimes become bureaucratic institutions that stifle creativity and critical thinking.